The Counting Child. A 7-year-old girl runs through fire-scorched dust with bleeding feet, carrying a secret that will shatter a town's most respected man. Tonight, her mother stops breathing between the beatings. Tomorrow, a broken rancher must choose between silence and war. If you're drawn to stories of courage rising from ashes, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Lila's voice can carry. The child's feet left blood prints in the dust. Caleb Hart saw them first as small dark marks leading up his drive, then closer, as smears that caught the late afternoon light like garnet scattered across pale earth. He'd been checking the fence line along his eastern pasture when movement pulled his attention. A flash of calico fabric, a stumbling shape too small to be out here alone, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. The girl collapsed 10 feet from his porch. Caleb crossed the distance in 4 strides, his shadow falling over her before he knelt. She couldn't have been more than 7, rail-thin with hair the color of winter wheat matted against her skull. Her dress hung torn at the shoulder. Both feet bled from a dozen cuts, and when she looked up at him, her eyes held something he recognized with cold familiarity. Terror that had learned to wait. "Please," she gasped. "Mama can't breathe right. She's—" The words dissolved into coughing that shook her whole frame. Caleb lifted her without asking permission. She weighed less than a feed sack. Inside, he set her on the kitchen bench and pumped water into a basin while she watched him with that terrible stillness children learned when movement brought consequences. "What's your name?" "Lila." Her voice barely reached him. "Lila Rowan." The name triggered recognition. Rowan. Evan Rowan, who owned the grain supply in town, who sat front row at church, who people spoke of with automatic respect. Caleb had seen him maybe twice in 5 years. A tall man with politician hands and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Where's your mother now?" "Home. He left for town an hour ago." Lila's fingers twisted in her lap, and Caleb noticed how she held her left arm close to her ribs. "She told me to count to 500 before I ran. She said if I ran too soon, he'd see me from the road." Something cold settled in Caleb's chest. He'd spent 5 years avoiding exactly this. Other people's disasters, other people's pain, the terrible weight of knowing things that demanded action. After Rachel died giving birth to their stillborn son, after he'd buried them both on the hill behind the house, he'd chosen silence and distance. The ranch stretched 40 acres in every direction with nothing but cattle and sky, and that had been enough. It wasn't enough now. "Your arm hurt?" Lila nodded. Caleb's hands, roughened by years of rope and leather, moved with surprising gentleness as he examined her. The arm wasn't broken, but deep bruises colored her shoulder purple-black. More bruises circled her wrists. He cleaned her feet while she sat rigid, not making a sound even when the water must have stung like hell. "How long since you ate?" "Yesterday, breakfast." He cut bread and cheese, poured milk. She ate like someone who'd learned hunger, methodically, without pleasure. While she ate, Caleb pulled on his boots and checked his rifle, not loaded, but visible. Then he saddled Goliath, his 15-hand roan gelding, and lifted Lila up onto the horse's broad back. "We're going to your mother now. You're going to tell me exactly how to get there, and you're going to tell me what I'm walking into." The ride took 20 minutes cross-country. Lila spoke in fragments, her voice nearly lost in the rhythm of hoofbeats. Between her words, Caleb built a picture he'd seen before, in the war, in the camps. Power that fed on fear, violence that hid behind respectability. "He doesn't hit where people can see. Mama taught me that. Ribs, back, places covered by clothes." Lila's hands gripped Goliath's mane. "She counts too. After. She writes it down in her book. Every time. The date and what he did and how long until she could stand up again." "Where's this book?" "Floorboard under her bed. 3rd one from the window." Caleb filed that information away. Evidence mattered. Truth needed proof, especially when lies wore expensive suits. The Rowan house sat at the end of a tree-lined drive, white-painted with green shutters and a wraparound porch that spoke of prosperity. Flower boxes hung beneath windows. A tire swing moved gently in the breeze. It looked like something from a catalog, the kind of home that promised safety. Caleb knew better than to trust paint and porches. He dismounted and lifted Lila down, but she ran ahead, taking the porch steps in a single leap despite her injured feet. The front door stood unlocked. Inside, the house held that particular silence that comes before or after violence, air that hasn't settled, dust still swirling in late light. "Mama?" Lila's voice cracked. "Mama? I brought help." The response came as a wet, labored breathing from upstairs. Caleb followed Lila up the steps, down a hallway lined with family photographs. Evan Rowan's smile repeated in gilt frames, Lila at various ages always unsmiling, and a woman whose beauty carried the fragility of porcelain under constant threat. The bedroom door stood open. Mara Rowan lay on the floor between the bed and the wall, curled into herself like something broken and discarded. Blood matted her dark hair. Her face had swollen into a mask of purple and red, both eyes nearly shut. She breathed in short, shallow gasps that suggested broken ribs. Maybe worse. Lila dropped beside her mother, small hands hovering, afraid to touch. "Mama, I counted to 500, just like you said." Mara's fingers found her daughter's face with the blind certainty of recognition. Her split lips moved, forcing words through damage. "Good girl, my brave." Coughing cut her off, and blood flecked her chin. Caleb knelt on her other side. "Mrs. Rowan, I'm Caleb Hart. Your daughter came to my ranch. I'm going to move you now, and it's going to hurt." Her eyes, what he could see of them through the swelling, found his. One hand lifted in what might have been protest or permission. When he gathered her up, she made no sound at all, though her body went rigid with pain. She weighed almost nothing, lighter even than Rachel had been, and the comparison hit him like a fist. "Lila, get that book from under the bed." The child moved fast, counting floorboards aloud until she reached the third. It pried up easily, revealing a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth. Lila tucked it inside her dress. Caleb carried Mara down the stairs and outside into the cooling evening. Goliath stood patient while Caleb mounted awkwardly with his burden, then lifted Lila up to sit in front of him. The three of them rode back across the valley as the sun bled out along the western hills, painting everything the color of old wounds. At the ranch, Caleb put Mara in his bed, the only bed, and sent Lila to pump water. He'd served as a field medic during the war, stitching men who screamed and men who'd gone silent, learning to read damage by touch and sight. Mara's ribs were broken, at least 3. Her left cheekbone probably cracked. Internal bleeding was possible. She needed a doctor. She needed a lot of things. But first she needed to survive the night. He cleaned her face and hands, wrapped her ribs as tightly as he dared, and got laudanum down her throat mixed with water. While she drifted into uneasy unconsciousness, Lila sat in the corner of the room, watching with eyes too old for her face. "Is Mama going to die?" Caleb measured his words. "Not if I can help it. Papa will come looking. I expect he will. He'll be angry. That's his problem, not yours." Lila studied him with that unnerving directness children developed when they'd learned to read danger in adult faces. "You're different than most people." "How's that?" "You're not pretending nothing's wrong." The simple observation landed heavier than it should have. Caleb stood and moved to the window, watching darkness settle over land he knew in his bones. 5 years he'd lived here, speaking to almost no one, buying supplies once a month in town, attending no socials or church services, building a life that asked nothing of anyone and offered nothing in return. That was over now. Behind him, Lila's voice came again, smaller. "I counted to 500. That's what Mama said to do. Count to 500, then run to the big ranch east of the hills. Find the man who lives alone, tell him what's happening. She made me practice the counting every day." "You did exactly right. Sometimes I count other things. When Papa's hurting Mama, I count how many times she breathes between. That's how I know when it's really bad. Tonight it was 7 breaths between. Sometimes it's 3 or 4, but tonight was 7. Caleb closed his eyes. The worst parts of war weren't the battles. They were the things children remembered, the numbers they counted, the systems they built to survive what should never have touched them. "You don't have to count anymore," he said. Lila didn't answer. The next 3 days passed in careful stillness. Caleb tended Mara's wounds while she drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting damage and laudanum in equal measure. When she was awake, she didn't speak, just watched him with dark eyes that held questions she didn't ask. Lila helped where she could, pumping water, feeding the chickens, sitting vigil beside her mother in the hours before dawn when fever made Mara restless. The child moved through the house like a ghost, making herself small, useful, invisible. It took Caleb until the second day to realize she was doing exactly what she'd been taught. Take up no space, cause no trouble, give no reason for anger. "Lila," he said on the third morning, finding her washing dishes she'd already washed twice. "You live here now. You don't have to earn that." She looked at him with confusion. "Everything gets earned." "Not safety. Safety's not something you earn or lose. It just is." But even as he said it, Caleb knew he was lying. He'd lost his safety when Rachel died. These two had never had it at all. And now Evan Rowan would come, because men like that always did. He came on the fourth day. Caleb heard the horse before he saw it, a single rider approaching fast from the north road. He stepped onto the porch with his rifle, not aimed but ready, and watched Evan Rowan rein in his black gelding at the fence line. Even from a distance, Rowan cut an impressive figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit that cost more than most men made in a year. His face held the kind of handsome that people trusted automatically. Strong jaw, clear eyes, features that suggested competence and control. "Mr. Hart," Rowan's voice carried easy authority. "I believe you have my wife and daughter. I have two people who came to me injured and afraid. Whether they're yours seems like a question better left to them." Rowan dismounted with practiced grace and approached the fence. He didn't cross it, which showed either respect for property or calculation about positioning. Caleb figured the latter. "There's been a misunderstanding," Rowan said. "My wife is unwell. She has spells, delusions. Sometimes she hurts herself and doesn't remember. It's a sickness, Mr. Hart. A terrible burden for our family." The lie came wrapped in concern so perfect it almost sounded true. Caleb had heard similar stories during the war, officers explaining away brutality as discipline, necessary correction, misunderstanding. The words changed, but the melody stayed the same. "That's so?" "It is. And my daughter, young as she is, sometimes believes her mother's delusions. It breaks my heart." Rowan's hand pressed against his chest in a gesture of pained sincerity. "I've consulted doctors, tried every treatment, but Mara refuses help. She runs, and I have to bring her back before she harms herself further. She's got 3 broken ribs and a cracked cheekbone. That's impressive self-harm." Something flickered behind Rowan's eyes, a coldness that vanished almost before it appeared. "You see? This is exactly the kind of detail that sounds convincing when Mara tells it. She's quite good at gaining sympathy. It's part of the illness. She hasn't told me anything. She's barely conscious." "Then perhaps you're operating on limited information." Rowan's tone shifted, became more pointed. "Mr. Hart, you're new to this area, relatively speaking. You don't know our family, our history. I'm asking you, man to man, to let me take my wife and daughter home where they belong." "No." The refusal hung in the air between them. Rowan's jaw tightened. "I could get the sheriff." "You could try. But I'd have questions about why your wife ran barefoot across 3 miles of rough country with a child who had to count to 500 before she felt safe to move. I'd want to know about the journal she keeps, documenting dates and injuries. I'd want to know why a 7-year-old can describe in detail which ribs hurt her mother most and how long it takes for different kinds of bruises to fade." Rowan went very still. "You have no right to keep my family from me. They're not things to be kept. They're people who made a choice." Mara's confused. She doesn't know what she's doing. She knew enough to teach her daughter an escape plan. For a long moment, neither man moved. Caleb watched Rowan's face cycle through calculations. Legal options, social pressure, violence. The violence option seemed to win. Rowan's hand drifted toward the pistol at his belt. "I wouldn't," Caleb said quietly. "I've killed men for less than what you've done, and I'd sleep fine after." The threat carried enough truth that Rowan's hand stopped. He stood at the fence, a man used to getting his way, discovering the limits of his power, and Caleb saw the exact moment when Rowan shifted from negotiation to war. "This isn't over," Rowan said. No, it's not. Rowan mounted his horse with theatrical precision and turned back toward town. Caleb watched until the dust settled, then went inside to find Lila standing at the window, her small hands pressed against the glass. "He'll tell everyone you stole us," she said. "Probably." "People believe him. They always believe him." "Maybe, but believing gets harder when the lies get bigger." Lila turned to face him. "What if the lies win?" Caleb thought about Rachel, about the war, about every time he'd seen truth lose to power and comfort to courage. "Then we make the truth louder." By evening, word had spread through town like fever. Caleb knew because neighbors he'd never met started appearing at his gate. Not to help, but to stare, to judge, to carry stories back to wherever stories got told. Mrs. Henderson from the general store, the Pritchard brothers who owned the lumber mill, even Pastor Wells, whose church Caleb hadn't attended in 5 years. They didn't cross the fence. They just looked, whispered, and left. Inside, Mara woke properly for the first time. Caleb heard her voice, thin but clear, calling for Lila. He found them in the bedroom, mother and daughter pressed together carefully, Mara's battered face against her child's hair. "Thank you," Mara said when she noticed Caleb in the doorway. Her words came slurred from her split lip. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did." "Evan will destroy you." "He can try." Mara's laugh turned into a cough that made her gasp and clutch her ribs. When she recovered, she looked at him with clear eyes despite the swelling. "You don't understand. He owns this town. The businesses, the debts, the favors. He's been building his kingdom for 15 years, and everyone owes him something. What about you? What do you owe him?" "Everything, according to him. My life, my daughter's life, my silence." She touched Lila's face gently. "He married me because I was young and quiet, and he thought I'd be grateful. And I was, for a while, before I learned what gratitude cost." "The journal," Caleb said. "Can I see it?" Lila retrieved the leather-bound book from where she'd hidden it under the kitchen sideboard. Caleb carried it to the porch where the last light still held and opened it to the first page. March 14th, 1873. "Struck me across the face for burning dinner, left bruise on right cheek, told neighbors I fell." The entries continued in Mara's precise handwriting, page after page, 3 years of documented brutality. Dates, descriptions, injuries, a catalog of violence so methodical it read like a ledger. June 2nd, 1873. "Kicked my ribs when I questioned household expenses. Couldn't breathe properly for 2 weeks. Told doctor I'd fallen off a horse." September 18th, 1873. "Broke my wrist twisting my arm behind my back." He was angry about how I disciplined Lila. Set and wrapped it himself. Forbade me from seeing Dr. Morrison. December 25th, 1873. Christmas. "Struck me repeatedly for overcooking the goose. Lila hid in the cellar, found her there 3 hours later, counting stones. The entries grew worse, more frequent, more detailed. And between them, notes about Lila. How the child had started counting as a way to measure time, to predict danger, to survive." April 3rd, 1874. "Lila has begun counting my breaths when Evan hurts me. She says she knows it's bad when I can't breathe between. She's 5 years old. 5. What have I done to her?" November 19th, 1874. "Taught Lila the plan today. If things get worse, she counts to 500, then runs to the Hart Ranch. I heard he's a veteran, lives alone. A man who's seen violence might recognize it in others. It's a desperate hope, but hope nonetheless." Caleb closed the journal carefully. In the fading light, his hands looked dark with other people's blood. Blood from the war, from Rachel's death, from carrying Mara's broken body. He'd tried so hard to wash himself clean, to live quietly, to avoid exactly this kind of entanglement. But Lila had counted to 500 and run 3 miles on bleeding feet because her mother had taught her to hope. And that hope had landed here, on his porch, in his life, demanding he become someone other than the ghost he'd chosen to be. Inside, Lila was singing to her mother, some soft lullaby that drifted through the open window like smoke. The child's voice carried simple comfort, the kind that didn't ask questions or demand promises. Caleb stood and walked to the barn where Goliath waited in his stall. The horse nickered softly, pushing his massive head against Caleb's chest. For 5 years, this animal and the land had been Caleb's only company. It had been enough because it asked nothing, offered nothing, risked nothing. "Things are about to get complicated," he told the horse. Goliath snorted agreement. Tomorrow, Caleb would have to ride into town. He'd have to stand in front of people who'd already chosen their version of truth and offer them an alternative. He'd have to fight Evan Rowan not with fists, but with words, evidence, witnesses, weapons he'd never trusted as much as a rifle. But tonight, 2 people slept under his roof who'd had no safety until they found it here. A woman who'd documented her own destruction hoping someone might believe her. A child who'd learned mathematics through survival. Caleb Hart had spent 5 years convinced that caring about anything beyond his fence line would break what little remained of him. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe this would shatter him completely, but maybe some things were worth breaking for. He returned to the house and found Mara awake, Lila asleep beside her. Mara's eyes tracked him as he entered, wary but not afraid. "Tomorrow I'm going into town," he said. "I'm going to talk to the sheriff, show him your journal, and file a complaint. Rowan will deny everything. People will take his side. It's going to get ugly." "I know." "You could still leave, take Lila, go somewhere Rowan can't find you. Start over." Mara's laugh came bitter. "With what money? What skills? I'm a woman with a violent husband and a child. The next town would be exactly like this one. People looking away, making excuses, protecting the man with power." She touched the journal lying between them. "At least here, I have proof. At least here, I have you. You don't know me. I know you didn't hesitate. When Lila came to you bleeding and terrified, you didn't ask questions or demand explanations or tell her to go home and work it out. You just came." Mara's damaged face held something that might have been a smile. "That's enough." Caleb sat in the chair beside the bed, feeling the weight of her trust settle over him like a yoke. "I'm not good at this. Helping people, being around people. You're doing fine so far. This is different than harboring a woman and child. This is war. Then it's a war we fight together." Mara's hand found the journal, her fingers tracing the leather cover. "I've been counting too, Mr. Hart. Days, hours, injuries, numbers that added up to nothing but survival. Maybe it's time those numbers meant something else. Maybe it's time they added up to truth." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and sage and the promise of storms building west. Caleb listened to Lila's breathing, even and steady, the sound of a child sleeping without counting. For now, this house held peace. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. But tonight, the child wasn't counting, and that seemed like enough to fight for. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning that made promises the day wouldn't keep. Caleb rose before light touched the eastern hills, moving through the familiar rhythms of ranch work, feeding stock, checking water troughs, mending fence that didn't need mending. His hands knew the motions well enough that his mind could wander, and it wandered to the town he'd have to face in a few hours. Inside, he found Mara awake and sitting upright despite the pain it clearly cost her. She'd washed her face somehow, though the bruises had darkened overnight into shades of purple and green that made her features almost unrecognizable. Lila sat beside her mother, braiding and unbraiding a length of old rope. "You don't have to do this," Mara said when Caleb entered. Her voice still carried that slurred quality from her split lip. "I can take Lila and disappear, save you the trouble." "Where would you go?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Caleb poured coffee and set the pot on the table between them. "I'm riding to town in an hour, taking your journal to Sheriff Morrison. He's old school, been in office since before the war. If anyone might listen, it's him." Morrison plays cards with Evan every Thursday night. Mara's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. They're not friends exactly, but they're not strangers either. That changes when evidence gets involved. "Does it?" Mara met his eyes. "Mr. Hart, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you're underestimating how thoroughly Evan owns this town. It's not just money or influence. It's deeper than that. He knows things about people, their debts, their secrets, their shame. He collects leverage the way other men collect stamps." Lila looked up from her rope. Papa says knowledge is power, but the right kind of knowledge is a weapon. The casual way the child quoted her father's philosophy landed heavy in the quiet kitchen. Caleb thought about the journal, about 3 years of documented violence, and wondered if evidence mattered when lies had deeper roots. Maybe, he said. But silence is a weapon too, and we're done being silent. He saddled Goliath and secured the journal in his saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth against dust and weather. Before mounting, he looked back at the house where Mara stood in the doorway, one arm wrapped around her ribs, the other around Lila's shoulders. "Lock the doors," he called. "Don't answer for anyone but me." The ride to town took 40 minutes across open country that showed the first signs of autumn, grass going gold, cottonwoods along the creek bleeding yellow. Caleb had made this trip maybe a dozen times in 5 years, always for supplies, always speaking to as few people as possible. Today felt different. Today he was choosing to be seen. The town of Cedar Ridge sprawled along both sides of the main road like something that had grown haphazard and then tried to organize itself after the fact. The southern end held the respectable establishments: Morrison's General Store, the bank, the land office, the church with its white steeple visible for miles. The northern end collected everything else: saloons, the livery, rooms above the hardware store where women sold company to men with cash and no questions. Caleb tied Goliath outside the sheriff's office and carried the journal inside. Sheriff Tom Morrison sat behind a desk covered in paperwork and the accumulated dust of a man who'd stopped caring about appearances years ago. He was 60 if he was a day, white-haired and thick around the middle, with eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by human cruelty. "Caleb Hart," Morrison said without looking up. "Heard you took in Evan Rowan's wife and kid." "They came to me. I didn't take anything." "That's a matter of interpretation." Morrison finally raised his eyes. "Evan's filing papers claiming you kidnapped them. Says his wife is sick, delusional. Says you're holding them against their will." Caleb set the journal on the desk. "Read that, then tell me who's delusional." Morrison opened the book slowly, like a man handling something that might bite. He read the first page, then the second. His expression didn't change, but his hands tightened on the leather cover. After 5 pages, he closed it. "Where'd you get this?" "Mara Rowan kept it. 3 years of documentation. Dates, injuries, details. Could be fabricated. Could be, but her face tells the same story. 3 broken ribs, cracked cheekbone, bruises in places that don't come from falling down stairs." Caleb leaned forward. "Her daughter ran 3 miles barefoot to find help because her mother taught her to count to 500 before running so her father wouldn't see. That's not delusion, Sheriff. That's survival." Morrison sat back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "You know what you're asking me to do? Evan Rowan is a pillar of this community. He employs half the town directly or indirectly. He bankrolled the new church roof. Hell, he paid for my nephew's medical schooling. So you owe him. So everyone owes him." Morrison's voice carried weary truth. "That's how he operates. Little favors, generous loans, timely assistance. Then when he needs something, people remember what they owe." "What do you owe him?" The silence stretched long enough that Caleb thought Morrison might not answer. Finally, the older man sighed. "My daughter got in trouble a few years back. Gambling debts in Denver. Evan paid them off quietly, asked nothing in return, just said he understood family came first. And now family comes second to gratitude?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "You got no right to judge what you don't understand." "I understand plenty. I understand that good men do nothing while bad men build kingdoms. I understand that silence protects the powerful and buries the weak." Caleb tapped the journal. "I also understand that this is evidence of a crime, multiple crimes, and you swore an oath to uphold the law regardless of who breaks it. The law is one thing, justice is another, and politics is a third thing entirely." Morrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the main street. "Let's say I believe this journal. Let's say I arrest Evan Rowan. What happens next?" "Trial, evidence, truth. Trial requires witnesses. Who's going to testify against Evan? His wife, beaten and traumatized? His 7-year-old daughter? You, a man nobody knows who's lived like a hermit for 5 years?" Morrison shook his head. "Evan's lawyers will tear them apart. They'll paint Mara as unstable, you as an opportunist, and Lila as a confused child manipulated by her mother. So we do nothing? I didn't say that. Morrison turned back to face him. But you need to understand what you're starting. This won't be clean, it won't be quick, and it might not work at all. Caleb had expected resistance, but hearing it laid out so plainly still hit like a fist. What do you suggest? Document everything. Get Mara to a doctor. Get her injuries officially recorded. Find other witnesses. Anyone who's seen the bruises, heard the fights, noticed anything off about that marriage. Build a case so airtight that even Evan's money can't squeeze through the cracks. Morrison picked up the journal again. And be prepared for him to fight dirty. Because he will. I'm not afraid of Evan Rowan. Maybe you should be. Brave men end up dead or ruined when they underestimate powerful enemies. Caleb stood. Keep the journal. Copy what you need, but understand this. I'm not backing down. Those two people came to me for help, and I'm going to help them, with or without your badge. Morrison studied him with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. You served in the war? Shiloh, Vicksburg, Missionary Ridge? See much killing? More than enough. And you came back here to get away from it. Morrison's voice softened slightly. I understand that. I was at Antietam. Saw things that don't leave a man's head no matter how much whiskey he pours on them. Peace is hard to find after that kind of violence. Peace isn't worth much if it's built on looking away from other people's pain. Morrison almost smiled. You sound like my wife. She'd like you. He returned to his desk and pulled out a fresh ledger. All right, I'll open an official investigation. I'll need formal statements from you and Mara. I'll send word to Dr. Fletcher to examine her, record her injuries. It won't be comfortable for her. None of this is comfortable. No, but it's necessary if you want this to stick. Morrison began writing. Meanwhile, Evan's going to escalate. He'll spread rumors, call in favors, make your life difficult. Be ready for that. Caleb nodded and moved toward the door, but Morrison's voice stopped him. Hart, one more thing. If this goes to trial, if Mara testifies, she'll have to speak publicly about what happened to her. Every detail, every beating. In front of a courtroom full of people who know her, know Evan, know their family. That kind of exposure breaks some people. She's already broken. This is about putting the pieces back together. Maybe. Or maybe it's about breaking her in a different way. Morrison met his eyes. Make sure she knows what she's signing up for. Make sure she's strong enough. She counted 3 years of violence and taught her daughter an escape plan. She's stronger than anyone gives her credit for. Outside, the morning had warmed into something almost pleasant. Caleb stood on the sidewalk watching the town move through its rhythms. Wagons delivering goods, women shopping, children running between buildings. Normal life continuing while just beneath the surface, old lies started cracking. He'd made it maybe 10 steps toward Goliath when a voice called out behind him. Mr. Hart! Caleb turned to find Pastor Wells approaching, his dark suit immaculate despite the dust. The pastor was younger than Morrison, maybe 50, with the kind of face that looked trustworthy because it had practiced looking trustworthy for years. Pastor, I heard about the situation with Evan Rowan's family, troubling business. Wells folded his hands in front of him. I wonder if I might have a word. Nothing's stopping you. I've known Evan for 15 years. He's a good man, a faithful husband and father, a generous supporter of the church and community. The idea that he would harm his own family is frankly preposterous. Caleb waited. Wells seemed to expect a response, but Caleb had learned in the war that silence often revealed more than questions. I understand you're new to Cedar Ridge, relatively speaking, Wells continued. You don't know these people, their history, their character. Mara is a troubled woman. She's been under the care of physicians for nervous complaints. Sometimes she becomes confused, even violent toward herself. That's not what her face says. Appearances can be deceiving. I've counseled many families through difficult situations. Domestic troubles are best resolved privately, with prayer and patience, not through public accusations that destroy reputations. Domestic troubles. Caleb let the words hang between them. That's what we're calling broken ribs and a child who counts her mother's breaths to measure pain? Wells's expression tightened. I'm trying to help you, Mr. Hart. You're involving yourself in matters you don't understand. Evan is an important man. Making an enemy of him would be unwise. I'm not trying to make an enemy, I'm trying to tell the truth. Truth is subjective in matters of marriage. What happens between a husband and wife in their own home is private, sacred even. The church teaches that women should submit to their husbands, that men are the head of the household. Perhaps Mara simply needs reminding of her proper place. The words landed like a slap, and Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest, the same cold that had come before violence during the war, when talking stopped working and other solutions became necessary. Pastor, I'm going to give you the benefit of doubt and assume you're ignorant rather than complicit. But let me be clear, if you think beating a woman unconscious is teaching her her place, then your church and my conscience have nothing to say to each other. Wells's face flushed. You blaspheme. The good book clearly states, I don't care what your book says if you're using it to justify cruelty. Mara Rowan came to me with her daughter, both of them broken and terrified. That's not marriage. That's slavery. You have no right to judge. I have every right. And so do you, if you'd use it for something other than protecting powerful men who hide behind Scripture. Caleb turned away, but Wells grabbed his arm. The pastor's grip was surprisingly strong for a man who worked with words instead of tools. You're making a mistake. Evan will ruin you. This town will turn against you. And for what? A woman who's probably lying and a child too young to understand what she's saying? Caleb looked down at Wells's hand on his arm, then back up at the pastor's face. Let go. Something in his voice must have carried enough threat because Wells released him immediately, stepping back. Caleb continued to Goliath, mounted, and rode north without looking back. But he felt the pastor's eyes following him all the way out of town. The ride home gave him time to think about what Morrison and Wells had said. They were right about one thing. This would get worse before it got better. Evan Rowan had spent years building his power, and power didn't surrender easily. It fought. It clawed. It destroyed whatever threatened it. Caleb had chosen this fight anyway. At the ranch, he found Mara in the kitchen garden pulling weeds despite her injuries. She moved slowly, carefully, but she moved. Lila sat on the porch steps watching her mother with that careful attention children learned when adults were fragile. Shouldn't you be resting? Caleb asked. Mara didn't look up from the vegetables. I've been resting for 3 years. Every time Evan hit me, I rested. Every time he broke something, I rested. I'm done resting. Her hands, Caleb noticed, shook slightly as she worked. But she worked nonetheless. Sheriff Morrison is opening an investigation. He wants formal statements. He's sending Dr. Fletcher out tomorrow to examine and document your injuries. Mara's hand stilled. Fletcher plays cards with Evan, too. Everyone plays cards with Evan doesn't mean they're all bought. Caleb crouched beside her in the dirt. Morrison warned me this won't be easy. Evan will fight back. The town will take sides, and most of them won't be our side. Our side, Mara repeated softly. When did my nightmare become your fight? When your daughter showed up bleeding on my porch. When you trusted me with that journal. When I decided silence was worse than war. Mara finally looked at him, her battered face showing something that might have been gratitude or might have been grief. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Hart. You've already done more than anyone else ever did. This isn't about owing, it's about what's right. Right doesn't always win. No, but wrong shouldn't win by default because good people stay quiet. Lila approached them carrying a bucket of water she could barely lift. Mama, the chickens are thirsty. Mara smiled despite the pain it caused her split lip. Thank you, sweetheart. You're such a good helper. I counted them. We have 17 now. One of the hens was hiding. The casual mention of counting hit Caleb harder than it should have. This child measured everything in numbers because numbers were predictable, safe, something she could control when everything else in her world had been chaos. Lila, he said, you don't have to count anymore if you don't want to. She looked at him with those 2 old eyes. But what if I forget how? Forget how to count? No. Forget how to know when Mama's safe. When Papa hurt her, I counted. That's how I knew when to hide, when to help, when to run. Without counting, how will I know? Mara pulled her daughter close despite the pain it caused. You won't need to know, baby, because it's not going to happen anymore. But what if it won't? Mr. Hart is making sure of that, and so am I. Lila didn't look convinced, and Caleb didn't blame her. 7 years old, and she'd already learned that promises meant nothing against violence. That night, Caleb sat on the porch watching stars emerge while inside, Mara read to Lila from a book about birds they'd found on his shelf. Their voices drifted through the window. Mara's damaged but steady. Lila's bright with questions about migration patterns and wing shapes. Normal conversation. The kind families had when they weren't counting breaths or documenting bruises. The peace lasted until midnight when riders approached. Caleb heard them before he saw them. 3 horses moving fast from the south road. He grabbed his rifle and stepped off the porch into shadow, watching as the riders slowed near his fence line. They didn't dismount, just sat their horses in the moonlight like judges rendering verdict. "Hart!" one of them called out. "We need to talk." Caleb recognized the voice, Jacob Pritchard, who owned the lumber mill with his brother. They'd been among the gawkers who'd come to stare 2 days ago. "Then talk." "Not out here. Man to man, inside where it's civilized." "We're civilized enough where we are. Say what you came to say." Jacob shifted in his saddle. His companions stayed silent, faces hidden by shadow and hat brims. "Evan Rowan is a friend of ours. A good man who's done right by this town. We heard you're spreading lies about him, keeping his family from him, making trouble." "I'm not spreading anything. I'm telling the truth." "Truth according to a woman who's been sick in the head for years? Truth according to a man nobody knows who lives out here alone like some kind of hermit?" Jacob's voice hardened. "We don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up problems where none exist. 3 broken ribs and a cracked cheekbone say problems exist. Mara's had accidents before. Everyone knows she's clumsy, fragile. Evan's been patient with her, more patient than most men would be." Caleb felt that familiar cold settling in again. "You calling her a liar?" "I'm saying you're believing a woman's hysteria over a respected man's word. That's dangerous. Could get a man hurt making those kind of mistakes." The threat hung explicit in the night air. Caleb stepped forward into the moonlight where they could see his rifle, not aimed but ready. "Here's what I'm saying. Mara Rowan came to me injured and afraid. Her daughter came to me bleeding and traumatized. I'm keeping them safe until the law sorts out what happened. If Evan Rowan has a problem with that, he can take it up with Sheriff Morrison. And if you 3 have a problem with that, you can try taking it up with me. But know that I served 3 years fighting men who thought might made right, and I buried every single one who came at me personal." The riders exchanged glances. Whatever they'd expected, naked threat delivered with complete calm wasn't it. "You're making a mistake," Jacob said, but his voice had lost its edge. "That's my mistake to make." They sat there another moment, 3 dark shapes on horseback, considering options. Then Jacob turned his mount and the others followed, disappearing back toward town without another word. Inside, Caleb found Mara standing in the shadows, holding a cast-iron skillet like a weapon. She'd heard everything. "That was brave," she said quietly. "That was stupid. Next time they might come with more men and less talk." "Then what do we do?" Caleb looked at her. This woman who'd survived 3 years of documented brutality, who'd taught her daughter escape plans, who pulled weeds in a garden while broken bones healed. She wasn't asking him to save her. She was asking him to fight beside her. "We don't back down. We document everything like Morrison said. We build a case so strong that even Rowan's money and influence can't crack it. And we prepare for him to make this ugly because he will." "How ugly?" "As ugly as it takes." Mara set down the skillet and moved to the window, looking out at the empty yard where the riders had been. "I used to think if I was just better wife, better cook, better mother, he'd stop. I thought I was the problem. Took me 2 years to realize the problem wasn't me failing to be good enough. It was him choosing to hurt me no matter what I did. Some men are broken that way. The war taught me that. Some people only feel powerful when they're destroying something weaker. And some people fight back." Mara turned to face him. "Thank you for being the kind who fights back. I'm just doing what needs doing." "No, you're doing what's right even though it costs you. That's different. That's rare." Caleb didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't try. They stood in the quiet kitchen while outside the night settled into the kind of silence that precedes storms. Tomorrow, Dr. Fletcher would come. Tomorrow, the formal process would begin. Tomorrow, Evan Rowan would escalate. But tonight, Lila slept without counting, and Mara stood straight despite broken ribs, and the ranch that had been empty for 5 years held something that felt almost like purpose. Morning brought Dr. Fletcher riding a gray mare and carrying a leather medical bag that had seen better decades. He was older than Morrison, smaller than Wells, with hands that shook slightly, but eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Rowan," he said after Caleb had shown him inside. "I heard you'd had some trouble." Mara sat in the kitchen chair, Lila pressed against her side. That's one way to describe it. Fletcher set down his bag and pulled up a chair opposite her. "Sheriff Morrison asked me to examine you, document your injuries for official record. That means I need to look at everything, ask questions that might be uncomfortable. You understand?" "I understand. Mr. Hart, I'll need you to step outside while I conduct the examination." Caleb looked at Mara, who nodded permission. He left, taking Lila with him to feed chickens and check fence lines, busy work to keep the child occupied while her mother described violence in clinical terms. The examination took an hour. When Fletcher finally emerged, his face carried the carefully neutral expression doctors learned for delivering bad news. 3 broken ribs, left side, cracked cheekbone, right side. Multiple contusions in various stages of healing. Evidence of previous injuries poorly set. Her left wrist shows signs of an old break that wasn't properly treated. Bruising consistent with being struck repeatedly with a closed fist. Fletcher recited the litany like reading a list. "I've documented everything in my notes for Sheriff Morrison." "Thank you," Caleb said. Fletcher packed his bag slowly, carefully, like a man arranging thoughts as well as instruments. "I've been doctoring in this town for 30 years. I've seen things that people hide, things they lie about, things they pretend didn't happen. I've set bones and stitched wounds and kept secrets because that's what doctors do." But there's a difference between privacy and complicity, between discretion and cowardice. Fletcher met Caleb's eyes. "I've known Evan Rowan for 15 years. He's charming, generous, connected. He's also brought his wife to me 4 times for injuries he claimed were accidents, falls, clumsiness, her own delicate constitution. I believed him because believing him was easier than asking hard questions. And now? Now I'm asking, now I'm documenting, now I'm telling you that if this goes to court, I'll testify to what I found today and what I should have seen years ago." Fletcher's hands tightened on his bag. "It won't make me popular, might cost me patience, but some things matter more than popularity." After Fletcher left, Caleb found Mara in the bedroom staring at nothing. Lila had fallen asleep on the bed, exhausted by worry and waiting. "He believed you," Caleb said. "He believed the evidence. That's different." Mara's voice came flat, emotionless. "Do you know what it's like, describing your own destruction to a stranger? Listing injuries like grocery items? This bruise, that break, these scars. Quantifying pain for official record." "No. It makes it real in a way hiding didn't. When it was private, when it was secret, I could pretend it wasn't as bad as it was. But saying it out loud, having someone write it down, knowing it'll be read by judges and lawyers and townspeople who'll whisper about it over dinner, that makes it permanent." Caleb sat in the chair Fletcher had occupied hours earlier. "You can still stop this. We can still find another way." "What other way? Run? Hide? Wait for Evan to find us and make it worse?" Mara shook her head. "No. I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending. If this is permanent, then let it be permanent truth instead of permanent silence. It's going to hurt. It already hurts. At least this hurt has purpose." That afternoon, word came via a rider Caleb didn't recognize, a summons to appear before Judge Harrison in 3 days for a hearing regarding custody of Lila Rowan and the disposition of Mara Rowan. Evan Rowan had filed formal complaints. The legal war had begun. Caleb rode back to town to find Morrison, who looked older and more tired than he had 2 days ago. "Harrison's tough but fair," Morrison said. "He won't be swayed by Evan's money alone. But he'll want to see real evidence, hear credible testimony. This hearing will determine if Mara keeps custody of Lila or if Evan gets them back." "Based on what we've shown you, how can that even be a question?" "Because family law favors fathers. Because Evan will have expensive lawyers arguing Mara is unstable. Because even with Fletcher's testimony and that journal, it comes down to who the judge believes." Morrison spread his hands helplessly. "I'm telling you what we're up against. It's not enough to be right. We have to prove it beyond what any reasonable person could deny. Then we find more evidence, more witnesses. From where? Who in this town will stand up against Evan Rowan? The question hung between them like smoke. Caleb thought about the Midnight Riders, about Pastor Wells' warnings, about how thoroughly Evan had woven himself into the town's fabric. Power wasn't just money or violence. It was the slow accumulation of favors and fears until people couldn't imagine opposing you. There has to be someone, Caleb said. Someone who saw something, heard something, knows something that proves what kind of man Rowan really is. Morrison looked doubtful, but nodded. I'll ask around quiet-like. But don't get your hopes up. Fear makes people blind and deaf when it's convenient. Caleb spent the next 2 days preparing for the hearing like preparing for battle, gathering supplies, checking equipment, running through scenarios. He coached Mara on what to expect, how to answer questions, how to stay calm when lawyers tried to rattle her. He told Lila she might have to speak to the judge, might have to describe what she'd seen, and watched the child's face close down into careful blankness. On the third day, they rode to town in Caleb's wagon, him driving, Mara beside him, Lila between them. The child counted fence posts the whole way, her lips moving silently with numbers that gave her something solid to hold on to. The courthouse occupied a 2-story brick building at the south end of town, imposing enough to remind people that law mattered even on the frontier. Inside, the hearing room smelled of old wood and older paper, decades of disputes settled and recorded. Evan Rowan sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 lawyers in expensive suits, looking every inch the wronged husband. When Mara entered, his face arranged itself into concern so practiced it looked genuine. "Mara," he called out, "thank goodness you're all right. I've been so worried." She didn't respond, didn't even look at him. Caleb felt her trembling beside him, but her face stayed composed, distant. Lila pressed against her mother's other side, small and silent. Judge Harrison entered. A lean man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen through too many lies to be impressed by new ones. He took his seat, arranged papers, and looked up at the room with the expression of someone about to waste time he didn't have. "We're here regarding custody of the minor child, Lila Rowan, and the disposition of Mara Rowan, who's claimed by her husband, Evan Rowan, to be held against her will by Mr. Caleb Hart. Mr. Rowan's counsel, you may present your case." The lead lawyer, a man named Coleman, who'd apparently come from Denver specifically for this, stood and began his performance. Mara was troubled, prone to delusions, possibly dangerous to herself and her daughter. Evan had been patient, loving, devoted, despite his wife's illness. Mr. Hart had taken advantage of a sick woman's confusion to insert himself into family matters. There was no evidence of abuse, only evidence of a concerned husband trying to get help for his ailing wife. Coleman spoke for 20 minutes, painting a picture of devoted father, struggling mother, an interfering stranger that almost sounded plausible if you ignored the bruises still visible on Mara's face. When he finished, Judge Harrison turned to Morrison. "Sheriff, you're representing the defense?" "In a manner of speaking, Your Honor. I've conducted an investigation into Mrs. Rowan's claims of abuse. I'd like to present evidence." Morrison submitted the journal first, describing its contents in clinical detail, then Fletcher's medical report, then his own documentation of Mara's injuries when she first arrived at Caleb's ranch. The evidence piled up, undeniable in its specificity. Coleman objected repeatedly. The journal could be fabricated, the injuries could be self-inflicted, medical opinions were just opinions. He made it sound like everything was questionable, nothing certain. Judge Harrison read through the journal carefully, his expression giving nothing away. When he finished, he looked at Mara. "Mrs. Rowan, did you write this?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Every entry?" "Every one. 3 years of entries. Sometimes I'd write them while bleeding. Sometimes I'd wait until he left for work. But I wrote them all." "Why?" Mara's hands twisted in her lap. "Because I knew no one would believe me without proof. Because Evan is respected, connected, powerful. Because I needed something more than my word against his if I ever found the courage to leave." "And have you fabricated any of these entries?" "No, Your Honor. I wish I had. I wish these were lies, but every word is true." Coleman stood. "Your Honor, my client's wife is clearly ill. These delusions, Sit down, Mr. Coleman. I'm not finished. Harrison's voice carried steel beneath the courtesy. He turned to Lila. Young lady, I need to ask you some questions. Can you do that? Lila looked at her mother, who nodded permission. The child's voice came small but clear. Yes, sir. Yes. What's your name? Lila Marie Rowan. How old are you, Lila? 7. I'll be 8 in November. And where do you live? I lived with Mama and Papa. Now I live with Mama and Mr. Hart. Why did you leave your papa's house? Lila's hands clenched in her lap, mirroring her mother's gesture. Because Mama got hurt real bad. She couldn't breathe right. I counted to 500 like she taught me, then I ran to Mr. Hart's ranch to get help. Who hurt your Mama? Papa did. He hurts her a lot. That's why Mama taught me to count. Coleman stood again. Your Honor, the child is clearly coached. Mr. Coleman, if you interrupt one more time, I'll hold you in contempt. Harrison returned his attention to Lila. How do you know it was your papa who hurt your mama? Because I see him do it. When he gets angry, he hits her, sometimes with his fists. Sometimes he throws her into things. One time he broke her wrist and fixed it himself so she couldn't go to the doctor. Lila recited this with the same flat tone she used for counting, facts without emotion. I count when it happens. That's how I know when it's really bad. What do you count? Mama's breaths. When she can't breathe good between the hurting, that's when I know it's bad. That night before I ran, she breathed 7 times between. That's really bad. Usually it's 3 or 4, but 7 means she might die. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Even Coleman seemed at a loss for objections. Harrison leaned forward. Lila, do you want to go back to living with your papa? No, sir. Why not? Because he'll hurt Mama again. And maybe he'll hurt me too. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure I regretted it. Lila's voice dropped to a whisper. I don't want to regret telling the truth. Harrison sat back, his face carved from stone. He looked at Evan, who'd maintained his mask of concerned husband throughout. Mr. Rowan, do you wish to testify? Evan stood with practiced grace. Your Honor, I love my wife and daughter. Mara's illness has been a burden our family has borne privately. I've sought treatment, consulted physicians, tried everything I could think of to help her. As for Lila's testimony, his voice broke convincingly. It breaks my heart that my daughter has been taught to fear me, to believe these lies her mother tells. You deny striking your wife? Absolutely. I've never raised a hand to Mara except to steady her when she's having one of her episodes. I've devoted years to her care, her treatment, her well-being. And this is how I'm repaid. With accusations, with slander, with my own child turned against me. The performance was masterful. Caleb watched several people in the courtroom nodding along, wanting to believe this version because it was easier than believing the alternative. Harrison studied Evan for a long moment. The problem with your story, Mr. Rowan, is the evidence. Dr. Fletcher has documented injuries consistent with repeated assault. This journal contains 3 years of detailed entries. Your daughter describes acts of violence with specificity no 7-year-old should possess. So either there's a vast conspiracy against you involving your wife, your daughter, a respected physician, and the county sheriff, or you're lying. Evan's mask slipped for just a second, revealing something cold and mean beneath the charm. Then he recovered. Your Honor, I can only tell you the truth as I know it. If others choose to believe lies, that's beyond my control. Indeed. Harrison shuffled papers. I'm going to take a brief recess to review this evidence and render my decision. Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. Those 30 minutes stretched like hours. Caleb stood with Mara and Lila in the hallway while townspeople whispered and stared. Some faces showed sympathy. Others showed judgment or doubt, or the carefully neutral expression of people choosing not to choose. When they reconvened, Harrison's face remained unreadable. I've reviewed the evidence presented today, the medical testimony, the documented journal entries, the testimony of the child. I've also considered the arguments regarding Mrs. Rowan's alleged mental illness and instability. He paused, and in that pause, Caleb felt Mara stop breathing beside him. In my 30 years on the bench, I've seen many cases of domestic discord. I've seen genuine mental illness, and I've seen violence disguised as care. I've learned to tell the difference. Harrison looked directly at Evan. Mr. Rowan, based on the evidence presented, I find your claims of your wife's delusion to be entirely fabricated. The injuries documented by Dr. Fletcher, the detailed record kept by Mrs. Rowan, and the testimony of your daughter all point to a pattern of sustained domestic violence. Evan's lawyers erupted in objections, but Harrison silenced them with a look. Therefore, I'm ruling as follows. Custody of Lila Rowan is granted to her mother, Mara Rowan. Mr. Rowan, you are prohibited from contact with your wife or daughter pending a full criminal investigation into allegations of assault. Mrs. Rowan is granted protection under territorial law, and any attempt to approach or threaten her will result in immediate arrest. The courtroom exploded in noise, some supportive, some shocked, all loud. Caleb felt Mara sag against him, held upright only by will and his arm around her shoulders. Lila pressed against them both, not crying but shaking. Evan stood slowly, his face transformed into something barely human. When he looked at Mara, his eyes promised violence that his mouth couldn't voice. This isn't over, he said quietly, but the words carried. No, Harrison agreed. It's not. Sheriff Morrison will be filing criminal charges. You'll have your day in court, Mr. Rowan. I suggest you use it to tell the truth for once. They left through the side exit to avoid the crowd, but Caleb could feel eyes following them, feel the town's opinion shifting and fracturing. Some people would believe the evidence. Others would cling to their image of Evan Rowan regardless of facts. But Mara had custody. Lila was safe. The counting could stop, at least for now. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the journey in, though Goliath pulled the wagon at the same steady pace. Mara sat rigid beside Caleb, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Lila dozed against her mother's side, exhausted by testimony and tension, her lips still moving silently with numbers even in sleep. They were a mile from town when Caleb noticed the riders. 3 men on horseback keeping pace about a quarter-mile behind, close enough to be seen, but far enough to avoid direct confrontation. Caleb recognized one of them, Jacob Pritchard, who'd come with his midnight warnings days ago. The other 2 stayed anonymous behind distance and hat brims. Don't look back, Caleb said quietly. We're being followed. Mara's breathing quickened. Evan? His friends, making sure we know they're watching. What do we do? Nothing. They want us scared. Best thing we can do is not give them the satisfaction. But his hand moved to the rifle tucked beneath the wagon seat, and he watched the riders in his peripheral vision while pretending total unconcern. They followed all the way to the ranch boundary, then stopped at the fence line and sat their horses like sentinels marking territory. Caleb helped Mara and Lila down from the wagon, unhitched Goliath, and went through the evening routine of feeding and watering stock while those 3 dark shapes watched from the distance. When he finally went inside, they were still there. They'll leave eventually, he told Mara, who stood at the window staring out at them. Once they think they've made their point. And what point is that? That the judge's ruling doesn't matter, that Evan still has power, that we should be afraid. Should we be? Caleb thought about the war, about night attacks, and the particular terror of waiting for violence you knew was coming but couldn't predict. Fear's useful when it makes you careful. Useless when it makes you paralyzed. We'll be careful. The riders stayed until full dark, then disappeared into the night like ghosts. But Caleb knew they'd be back. Men like that always came back. That night he slept in the chair on the porch with his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness and listening for hoofbeats. None came. The night passed quiet except for wind through the cottonwoods and the distant yipping of coyotes hunting rabbits in the far pasture. Morning brought Morrison riding alone, his face carrying news before his mouth formed words. Evan's filing an appeal, the sheriff said without preamble. Claims Harrison was biased, that the evidence was circumstantial, that Mara manipulated the court. Caleb had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still hit hard. How long until the appeal hearing? 3 weeks, maybe 4. Has to go before the territorial circuit judge when he makes his rounds. Morrison dismounted and accepted the coffee Mara brought out, though his hand shook slightly holding the cup. There's more. Evans hired investigators from Denver. They're digging into your background, Hart, looking for anything they can use to discredit you as a witness. They won't find much. I worked my ranch, kept to myself, paid my bills on time. What about before? During the war? Caleb's jaw tightened. I served, did what soldiers do, killed men who were trying to kill me. Any incidents? Anything that could be twisted to make you look violent, unstable, dangerous? The question pulled up memories Caleb had spent 5 years trying to bury. Shiloh, where he'd shot a Confederate officer who'd been 17 at most. Vicksburg, where he'd bayoneted a man in hand-to-hand fighting and felt the blade scrape bone. Missionary Ridge, where he'd held his best friend while the man bled out from a stomach wound, taking 4 hours to die. War's violent by definition, he said finally, but I wasn't court-martialed, wasn't dishonorably discharged. I served my time and came home. That may not be enough. Evan's lawyers are good at taking truth and bending it until it looks like lies. Morrison set down his cup. I'm telling you this so you're prepared. They're going to make you out to be some kind of violent recluse who kidnapped a vulnerable woman and her child. Let them try. The evidence speaks for itself. Evidence can be explained away. Juries believe stories more than facts, and Evan's lawyers tell better stories than we do. Morrison moved toward his horse, then paused. There's one more thing. Pastor Wells has been preaching about the sanctity of marriage, about wives submitting to husbands, about outside agitators destroying families. He hasn't mentioned you by name, but everyone knows who he means. Mara spoke from the doorway. The church has always protected Evan. It's part of how he built his power. Well, it's working. Half the town thinks you're a poor, confused woman led astray. The other half thinks you're a liar destroying a good man's reputation. Morrison's voice carried tired resignation. Truth's losing to comfort again. After Morrison left, Caleb found Mara in the kitchen garden again, pulling weeds with methodical precision despite her healing ribs. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow and green, making her look sickly rather than injured. You should rest, he said. I rested for 3 years while Evan built his kingdom, while he wove himself into every corner of this town until opposing him meant opposing everything. Her hands moved faster, ripping weeds with unnecessary force. I thought winning in court would be enough. I thought evidence and truth would matter. They do matter. Do they? Because it seems like Evan's story is winning even after we proved him a liar. She sat back on her heels, dirt streaking her dress. Maybe I should have just run. Taken Lila somewhere far away where no one knew us, started over with nothing. You'd have spent the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for him to find you. At least this way you're fighting. Fighting what? His money? His influence? His ability to make people believe black is white if it suits them? Mara's voice cracked. I'm so tired of fighting, Mr. Hart. So tired of being afraid. Of counting days between violence. Of teaching my daughter to survive instead of live. Caleb knelt beside her in the dirt. Then let me fight for a while. You've carried this alone for 3 years. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Why? The question came raw, desperate. Why do you care? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You could send us away right now and go back to your quiet life with your cattle and your solitude. Because 7 years old is too young to know how to measure her mother's pain by counting breaths. Because violence that hides behind respectability is still violence. Because... Caleb stopped, searching for words that captured something he barely understood himself. Because Rachel died, and I couldn't save her, couldn't do anything but watch her slip away. But you and Lila came to me alive, asking for help I could actually give. Maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe this is about me as much as you. Mara studied his face with those dark eyes that had learned to read danger in small gestures. You loved her very much. I did, and she died anyway. She did. So you know what it's like, loving someone and losing them despite everything you do. Mara's hand found his, dirt-stained fingers gripping tight. I loved Evan once, before I knew what he was. Before the first time he hit me and then cried and apologized and promised it would never happen again. I loved the man I thought he was, and when that man disappeared, I kept loving the memory while the reality destroyed me piece by piece. That's not love. That's survival. Maybe, but survival looks like love sometimes when you're drowning, Lila's voice called from the house, high and frightened. "Mama! Mr. Hart! Someone's coming!" They ran to the front of the house where Lila stood on the porch, pointing at the road. A buggy approached, elegant and expensive, pulled by matched bays that cost more than most families made in a year. As it drew closer, Caleb recognized the driver. A woman in her 50s, dressed in black silk despite the dust, with iron gray hair and a face that suggested she'd been beautiful before life had carved it into something harder. The buggy stopped at the gate. The woman descended without waiting for assistance and approached with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. "Mrs. Rowan," she said, "my name is Margaret Carlyle. I need to speak with you." Mara tensed. "I don't know you." "No, but I know your husband. Or rather, I knew what he was before you did." Margaret's eyes flicked to Caleb. "May we speak privately?" Caleb looked to Mara, who nodded slowly. They moved to the porch while Lila stayed inside, watching through the window. Margaret Carlyle didn't waste time on pleasantries. 20 years ago, I was married to Charles Carlyle, who owned half the mining interests in this territory. Evan Rowan worked for him as a clerk, ambitious and charming and always helpful. He seemed like a blessing to my husband's business. She paused, hands gripping her reticule like a lifeline. My daughter Eleanor was 16, beautiful, sheltered, trusting. Evan courted her with my husband's blessing, convinced us he was honorable despite the age difference. They were engaged within 6 months. Margaret's voice went flat, emotionless. 2 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor came to me with bruises on her arms. She said Evan had grabbed her during an argument, that he'd apologized profusely, that it was a mistake born of passion. Mara made a sound low in her throat. I wanted to believe it was a mistake. My husband wanted to believe it. Evan was so contrite, so devastated by his own behavior. The wedding went forward. Margaret's eyes closed. 3 months later, Eleanor was dead. Officially, she fell down the stairs. But I knew. I'd seen the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched around her own husband. I knew, and I said nothing. The silence that followed felt heavy as gravestones. "Why are you telling me this?" Mara asked. "Because when I heard you'd taken Evan to court, when I heard you documented his violence and fought back, I realized I'd let my daughter's death mean nothing. I protected Evan's reputation to protect my own. I let him walk away unpunished because admitting the truth would have destroyed my family's standing in society." Margaret opened her eyes, and they held a grief that time hadn't dimmed. "I won't make that mistake again." "What are you offering?" Caleb asked. "Testimony. Documentation." Eleanor kept a diary describing Evan's abuse. I've held on to it for 20 years, too cowardly to use it, but too guilty to destroy it. She pulled a small leather-bound book from her reticule. "It's yours now. Let my daughter's words help save you where they couldn't save her." Mara took the diary with shaking hands. "Mrs. Carlyle, Don't thank me. This doesn't absolve me of letting Eleanor die unavenged, but perhaps it prevents him from destroying another family." Margaret turned toward her buggy, then looked back. "Evan will fight this with everything he has. He'll lie, manipulate, threaten. He's had 20 years to perfect his methods, but you have something Eleanor didn't." "What's that?" "You have people who believe you. Use them. Fight him with everything you've got. Make sure my daughter didn't die for nothing." She left in a swirl of black silk and dust, her buggy disappearing toward town while Mara stood holding 2 journals, her own and Eleanor Carlyle's, 2 women separated by 20 years and united by one man's violence. That night, Mara read Eleanor's diary aloud while Lila slept and Caleb listened from his chair by the fire. The entries could have been Mara's own, the same progression from hope to fear, from love to survival, from believing promises to counting injuries. When Mara finished, her voice had gone hoarse. She was 16 years old and married to a man who killed her within months. "And he walked away clean," Caleb said. "Built his reputation, made his fortune, and did it all again with you." "How many others do you think? Between Eleanor and me, how many women did he hurt?" The question hung unanswered because some questions had no good answers. Caleb stood and moved to the window, watching darkness settle over land that had seemed safe until violence had found it again. "Tomorrow I'm riding to the territorial capital," he said. Morrison mentioned the circuit judge handles appeals. I want to make sure he sees both journals before Evan's lawyers get to him first. That's 3 days' ride each way. Then I'd better leave early. What if Evan comes here while you're gone? Caleb turned to face her. Morrison's agreed to send a deputy to watch the ranch. His name's Thomas Webb, young but reliable. He'll stay here while I'm traveling. I don't need a babysitter. No, but you need backup. Evan's lost his legal advantage. He's going to get desperate, and desperate men do stupid things. Mara looked at Eleanor's journal in her lap, at the words of a girl who'd trusted the wrong person and paid with her life. What if the circuit judge doesn't care? What if he's another man who thinks wives should submit regardless of what submission costs? Then we'll find another way. But we try this first. The deputy arrived at dawn, a lanky kid barely 20 with earnest eyes and a rifle he clearly knew how to use. Morrison had chosen well. Webb took up position on the porch while Caleb saddled Goliath and packed provisions for 6 days' hard riding. Mara walked him to the horse, Lila trailing behind counting pebbles she'd collected from the drive. Be careful, Mara said. Always am. I mean it. Evan's investigators might be watching the roads. If they realize what you're carrying, let them try to stop me. Caleb swung into the saddle, the journals wrapped in oilcloth and secured in his saddlebag. Morrison knows where I'm going. If I'm not back in 7 days, he'll come looking. 7 days is a long time. It's what it takes. Lila looked up from her counting. Mr. Hart, will you bring Mama something nice from the Capitol? Something that doesn't hurt? The question, asked with a child's simple hope, landed heavier than it should. Caleb thought about all the things that could be brought that didn't hurt. Books, ribbons, candy, 100 small luxuries, and how little they mattered against the weight of accumulated pain. I'll bring back justice if I can find it, he said. Justice is good, but candy would be nice too. Despite everything, Caleb almost smiled. I'll see what I can do. The ride to the territorial capital took 3 days of hard travel across country that went from grassland to foothills to the high mountain passes that still held snow in their shadowed places. Caleb pushed Goliath as hard as he dared, camping rough at night and eating jerky and hardtack while his mind churned through scenarios. He reached the capital on the evening of the 3rd day, a town twice the size of Cedar Ridge with actual paved streets and buildings that rose 3 stories, impressive by frontier standards. The courthouse occupied the central square, imposing stone construction that spoke of permanence and authority. Caleb stabled Goliath, took a room at a boarding house, and presented himself at the courthouse the next morning when the doors opened. The clerk who greeted him was a thin man with spectacles and the harried expression of someone drowning in paperwork. I need to see Judge Marcus Thornton, Caleb said, regarding an appeal scheduled from Cedar Ridge. Judge Thornton's calendar is full. You'll need to file a petition and wait for... Caleb set both journals on the clerk's desk. Tell him these document 20 years of domestic violence by the same man. Tell him one woman's already dead and another's fighting for her life. Tell him I'll wait as long as it takes, but I'm not leaving until he reads them. The clerk stared at the journals like they might bite, then at Caleb's face, which apparently convinced him this wasn't a bluff. Wait here. An hour passed, then 2. Caleb sat on a hard bench watching lawyers and petitioners flow through the courthouse like water through a mill, everyone fighting for some piece of justice or mercy or simple acknowledgement. Finally, the clerk returned. Judge Thornton will see you. 15 minutes, no more. Marcus Thornton's office occupied the top floor with windows overlooking the mountain peaks that ringed the Capitol. The judge himself was younger than Caleb expected, maybe 50, with sharp eyes and the build of a man who'd worked with his hands before working with his mind. Mr. Hart, Thornton said without preamble, my clerk says you have evidence regarding domestic violence. Caleb handed over the journals. The first documents 3 years of abuse by Evan Rowan against his current wife, Mara. The second documents similar abuse 20 years ago against Eleanor Carlisle, who died 3 months after marrying the same man. Thornton opened Mara's journal first, reading several entries before moving to Eleanor's. His face remained carefully neutral, but his hands tightened on the leather covers. This Eleanor Carlisle. What happened to her officially? Fell down the stairs, died of her injuries. Evan Rowan was never charged. And you believe he killed her? I believe patterns don't lie. Same methods, same progression, same kind of control. He did it before, he did it again, and he'll keep doing it unless someone stops him. Thornton closed the journals and stood, moving to the window. I've seen Evan Rowan's appeal petition. His lawyers argue that Judge Harrison was biased, that the evidence was circumstantial, that Mrs. Rowan is mentally unstable and manipulated the court. His lawyers lie for money. These journals tell the truth. Truth in one case doesn't prove truth in another. Legally speaking, Eleanor Carlisle's diary is hearsay regarding current charges. It can't be admitted as direct evidence. Caleb felt cold settling in his chest again. So it's worthless. I didn't say worthless. I said inadmissible as direct evidence, but it establishes pattern of behavior. It shows Evan Rowan has history of violence toward women he's married or engaged to. That matters when evaluating credibility. Thornton turned from the window. I'll be presiding over the appeal in 3 weeks. I can't promise an outcome, but I can promise I'll consider all available evidence, including these journals. That's all I'm asking. Is it? Because it seems like you're asking me to right a 20-year-old wrong and prevent a current tragedy. Those are different things, Mr. Hart. Justice and prevention don't always align. Maybe they should. Thornton almost smiled. Maybe. But the law deals with what is, not what should be. He handed back the journals. Keep these safe. Make copies if you can. And understand that even with this evidence, Evan Rowan might win his appeal. Money buys good lawyers, and good lawyers win cases. What would you do if it was your wife, your daughter? The question was unfair, and both men knew it. But Thornton answered anyway. I'd fight with everything I had, legal or otherwise. But I'm not in your position, Mr. Hart. I'm the judge who has to be impartial, regardless of what I believe personally. Caleb left with the journals, the judge's words, and a cold certainty that legal justice might not be enough. He bought supplies, including peppermint candy for Lila, and started the ride home. He was 2 days out from Cedar Ridge when he found the roadblock. 3 men on horseback waiting at a narrow pass where the trail wound between rock faces that made going around impossible. Caleb recognized one of them immediately, Jacob Pritchard. The other 2 he'd seen at the courthouse hearing, sitting behind Evan's lawyers. Caleb reined Goliath to a stop 50 feet from the blockade and waited. Pritchard rode forward alone, his hand resting too casually on his pistol. Hart, heard you took a trip to the Capitol. Man's free to travel. Man's free to mind his own business too. But you seem determined to stick your nose where it don't belong. Pritchard's horse shifted, uneasy. Whatever you're carrying in those saddlebags, Evan wants it. Evan wants a lot of things. Doesn't mean he gets them. We can do this easy or hard. Easy, you hand over whatever documents you got and ride on home. Hard, we take them and maybe you don't ride anywhere again. Caleb's hand drifted toward his rifle, slow and deliberate. 3 against 1. You boys that afraid of fair odds? Ain't about fair, it's about results. But Pritchard sounded less confident than his words suggested. See, that's where you're wrong. It's exactly about fair. About whether 3 men with guns are going to rob someone on a public road because a rich man told them to. About whether you're all willing to become criminals to protect someone who beats women. One of the other riders shifted uncomfortably. Jacob, this wasn't what we agreed to. Shut up. Pritchard's voice cracked like a whip. Evan pays us for results, and results is what we'll deliver. Evan pays you to intimidate, maybe to threaten. But murder? That's different. That's a hanging offense if you're caught. And I guarantee Sheriff Morrison knows I'm on this road. He knows when I left, when I'm expected back, and what I'm carrying. Caleb kept his voice level, conversational. You 3 want to hang for Evan Rowan's secrets? The uncomfortable rider spoke again. I didn't sign up for killing. I'm out. He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come without looking back. That left 2. Pritchard and a thick-built man with a scar across his jaw who'd been silent throughout. Both looked uncertain now, calculation replacing bravado. Last chance, Pritchard said. Hand over the documents. No. Then we're taking them. Pritchard's hand went for his pistol. Caleb's rifle cleared the saddle holster in one smooth motion, trained on Pritchard's chest before the other man's weapon fully cleared leather. The scarred man froze halfway to his own gun. "Drop it," Caleb said quietly. "Both of you, nice and slow." "You won't shoot. You're not a killer." "I killed 37 men during the war. Stopped counting after that because numbers stopped mattering. I can add 2 more if necessary, but I'd rather not. So drop the weapons and ride away, or make me do something we'll all regret." Something in his voice must have carried truth, because both men carefully set their pistols on the ground and backed their horses away. Caleb dismounted, collected the weapons, and threw them into the ravine beside the trail. They'd take an hour to retrieve, maybe more. "Tell Evan his intimidation isn't working," Caleb said. "Tell him the more he pushes, the harder we push back. And tell him that the next time he sends someone after me, they'd better be willing to finish the job, because I will." He remounted Goliath and rode through the pass without looking back, though his skin crawled expecting bullets until he'd cleared the narrow section and reached open country again. Only then did his hand stop shaking enough to holster the rifle. The rest of the journey passed without incident, and Caleb reached the ranch on the 6th day to find Mara and Lila safe, Deputy Webb still on watch, and the place exactly as he'd left it. Mara met him at the door, her face showing relief she tried to hide. "You're back." "Said I would be." "I know, but knowing and believing are different things." She helped him unsaddle Goliath while he told her about Thornton, about the roadblock, about Evan's escalating desperation. "He's getting reckless," Mara said. "That means he's scared." "Scared men are dangerous. So are cornered animals. But fear also means we're winning." She touched the journals tucked safely back in his saddlebag. "Judge Thornton really said he'd consider Eleanor's diary?" "He did. No promises, but he'll read it. That's more than we had before." Lila appeared from the house carrying her collection of counted pebbles, each one apparently significant in ways only she understood. "Did you bring me something?" Caleb pulled the peppermint candy from his pocket. "Something that doesn't hurt, as requested." The child's face lit up in the first genuine smile Caleb had seen from her. "Thank you. I'll save some for Mama." "You don't have to save any for me, sweetheart," Mara said. "That's all yours." "But sharing is important. Counting taught me that. If I have 10 pieces and give you 5, we both have 5. That's fair." Such simple mathematics, Caleb thought. Such complicated understanding of equity and care wrapped in numbers. This child who'd learned to measure survival was now using the same skills to measure generosity. That night, after Deputy Webb had bedded down in the barn and Lila slept inside, Caleb and Mara sat on the porch watching stars emerge over the mountain peaks to the west. The air carried the first real chill of autumn, promising winter in the months ahead. 3 weeks until the appeal, Mara said quietly. 3 weeks. And if we lose? We don't lose. But if we do? If Thornton rules in Evan's favor despite everything, what then? Caleb thought about the roadblock, about Pritchard's threats, about how close he'd come to shooting 2 men for protecting a liar. Then we run. Take Lila somewhere far from here, somewhere Evan's influence doesn't reach, and we start over. "We," Mara repeated. "You keep saying we." "That a problem?" "No, it's just—" She stopped, searching for words. "For 3 years, I was alone. Even surrounded by people, I was alone because no one saw the truth or cared enough to act. And now there's we. There's someone who fights beside me instead of for me or despite me. I'm not used to that." "Get used to it, because whatever comes next, we face it together." Mara leaned against his shoulder, careful of her still healing ribs, and they sat in silence while the night deepened around them. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Goliath answered with a nervous whinny from his stall, the ordinary sounds of a frontier ranch settling into darkness. But underneath the ordinary, violence waited. Evan Rowan's power had been challenged, his secrets exposed, his carefully constructed image cracked open for the world to see. Men like that didn't accept defeat gracefully. They fought back with everything they had, using whatever weapons came to hand. 3 weeks until the appeal. 3 weeks to prepare for whatever Evan would throw at them next. 3 weeks for Lila to count days instead of breaths, for Mara to heal bones and gather strength, for Caleb to fortify defenses against an enemy who'd already shown he'd rather destroy than lose. Inside, Lila called out in her sleep, a wordless sound of distress. Mara rose immediately, moving toward her daughter with the automatic response of mothers who'd learned their children's every sound. Caleb listened to her murmuring comfort, to Lila's breathing settling back into peaceful rhythms, to the small domestic sounds of care given and received. This was what they were fighting for. Not justice in the abstract, not revenge or vindication, but this, the simple right to live without counting, without fear, without measuring love by what it cost in pain. 3 weeks. Caleb stood and checked his rifle, reloaded his pistol, and made sure every door and window had working locks. Then he walked the perimeter of the ranch, looking for weaknesses, planning defenses, preparing for the war he knew was coming. Because Evan Rowan hadn't sent 3 men to rob him on the road as a final gesture. He'd sent them as an opening move, and opening moves were always followed by escalation. The next attack would come. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when it did, Caleb intended to be ready. He returned to the porch as false dawn began painting the eastern sky pale gray. Mara joined him, wrapped in a quilt against the cold, her face showing she'd slept as little as he had. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," she said. "Yes. Are we going to survive it?" Caleb looked at this woman who'd documented her own destruction for 3 years, hoping someone might believe her, who taught her daughter to count to 500 and run for help, who'd stood in a courtroom and spoken truth knowing the cost. She'd survived Evan Rowan's violence. She could survive his desperation. "We're going to do more than survive," he said. "We're going to win." And in the growing light, with the ranch waking around them and Lila safe inside, Caleb almost believed it. The attack came on the 13th night. Caleb woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of Goliath screaming in the barn. He rolled from his porch chair with the rifle already in his hands, his mind sorting details even as his body moved. Wind from the east carrying flame toward the house, multiple voices shouting coordination, the crack of breaking wood that meant someone had breached the barn door. Inside, Mara was already moving, gathering Lila from sleep with practiced efficiency born of 3 years preparing for emergencies. Deputy Webb stumbled from the barn's side entrance, coughing, his face black with soot. "They set the hay on fire," Webb gasped. 4 men, maybe 5, rode in fast and threw torches before I could get a shot off. Caleb's mind calculated distances, angles, options. The barn was lost. Too much dry hay, too much wood, flames already visible through gaps in the walls. But the house could be saved if they moved fast. "Webb, get the women to the root cellar. Lock them in and don't open it for anyone but me or Morrison." He tossed the deputy his pistol. "Someone comes at that door, you shoot first and ask questions after." "What about you?" "I'm getting Goliath out before he burns." "Hart, that's suicide." But Caleb was already running toward the barn, his shirt pulled over his mouth against the smoke. The heat hit him like a wall when he wrenched open the main door. Inside, flames crawled up the hay bales stacked along the east wall, smoke billowing thick enough to choke. Goliath reared in his stall, whites of his eyes showing, hooves striking wood with enough force to splinter the boards. "Easy, easy," Caleb chanted, forcing calm into his voice while his lungs screamed for clean air. He reached the stall and threw the bolt, expecting the horse to bolt. Instead, Goliath pressed against him, trembling but trusting in a way that made Caleb's throat tight. He grabbed the horse's mane and ran, leading Goliath through smoke so thick they navigated by memory and instinct. Behind them, something collapsed with a roar that sounded like cannon fire. Heat seared Caleb's back. Then they were through the door and into cold night air that felt like resurrection. Caleb led Goliath away from the burning barn, tying him to the fence near the house before turning back to assess the damage. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching 30 feet into the sky, turning night into hellish orange day. In the firelight, he could see riders circling at the edge of the property, dark shapes on horseback, watching their handiwork. One rider separated from the group and approached close enough for Caleb to recognize him, even through smoke and shadow. Evan Rowan sat his black gelding with the calm confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "Caleb Hart," Evan called out, his voice carrying over the crackle of burning wood. "I tried to be reasonable, tried to let the law handle this like civilized men, but you forced my hand." Caleb raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel at Evan's chest. "Get off my land." Your land. Everything in Cedar Ridge is my land, one way or another. The judge, the businesses, the people, all mine. You're just borrowing space until I decide otherwise. Evan's horse shifted, but the man's control never wavered. Give me my wife and daughter. Walk away from this tonight, and I'll let you leave with your life. She's not your wife anymore. Judge Harrison's order says so. Harrison's order is temporary. Judge Thornton will overturn it in 2 weeks, and then Mara comes home where she belongs. Evan's voice hardened. This is your last chance. Give them to me now, or I'll take them over your corpse. Behind Caleb, the barn's roof collapsed in an explosion of sparks and flame. The heat washed over him like a wave, but he didn't flinch, didn't lower the rifle. You want them, you'll have to go through me, and I don't die easy. Everyone dies eventually, Hart. Some just take longer than others. Evan wheeled his horse and rejoined his men. They sat there for another minute, 5 dark silhouettes against the burning barn, then rode off into the darkness like demons returning to hell. Caleb waited until the hoofbeats faded completely before lowering his rifle and moving to the root cellar. He knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice more. The signal he'd arranged with Webb. The door opened to reveal Mara holding Lila, both their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Webb stood behind them with the pistol still drawn, looking young and shaken, but steady. The barn? Mara asked, though the answer was written in orange light across Caleb's smoke-stained face. Gone. Everything in it except Goliath. And them? Gone too, for now. They emerged into a yard transformed by destruction. The barn had collapsed into itself, a funeral pyre of everything Caleb had built over 5 years. Tools, hay, equipment, the accumulated materials of a working ranch. The heat was still too intense to approach, so they stood at a safe distance and watched it burn. Lila's small voice cut through the roar of flames. How many men were there, Mr. Hart? 5, maybe 6. I counted 7 horses, the hoofbeats when they left, 7 different rhythms. Even now, traumatized and exhausted, the child counted. Caleb filed the information away. 7 men meant Evan had brought more force than expected, more than he'd need just for intimidation. He's escalating faster than I thought, Mara said quietly, reading Caleb's thoughts. The appeal isn't for 2 weeks. He should be waiting for the legal process. Legal process isn't giving him what he wants fast enough, so he's taking what he wants by force. Caleb turned to Webb. You need to ride to town, wake up Morrison, and tell him what happened here. Evan Rowan and 6 men committed arson, made terroristic threats, and attempted murder. That's enough for arrest warrants. Webb nodded and moved toward his horse, then paused. Hart, Morrison's going to ask for evidence. We got any beyond your word? 7 sets of hoof prints, burn patterns that show multiple points of ignition. And this. Caleb pulled something from his pocket, a brass button he'd found in the barn, probably torn off when one of the arsonists was setting fires. The button carried an engraved design he recognized from Evan's waistcoat. Physical evidence linking Evan to the scene. Webb took the button and rode hard for town while Caleb, Mara, and Lila retreated to the house. Dawn was still hours away, but none of them would sleep. They sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, Lila's heavily diluted with milk and sugar, and watching the barn burn down to embers through the window. I'm sorry, Mara said finally. This is my fault. My past catching fire in your present. Stop. Evan did this, not you. He's responsible for his own violence. But you're suffering for my choices. You could have turned us away that first day. Should have, probably. Instead, you took us in, fought for us, and now your home is burning because of it. Caleb looked at her across the scarred kitchen table. This woman who'd survived 3 years of documented brutality and still found the strength to feel guilt for someone else's losses. That barn was wood and nails. It can be rebuilt. But if I'd turned you away, if I'd let Evan take you back, I'd have spent the rest of my life knowing I chose comfort over courage. The barn's replaceable. My conscience isn't. Still, I'm sorry. I know, but sorry doesn't change what needs doing. Come morning, we document everything for Morrison. We build the case for Evan's arrest, and we prepare for him to try again, because he will. Lila had been quiet, but now she spoke up. Mr. Hart, when Papa came tonight, I counted how long he talked to you. It was 147 seconds. That's the longest I ever heard him talk without getting angry. Usually by 40 seconds he's yelling, and by 80 he's hitting something. The casual analysis, delivered in a child's matter-of-fact tone, landed like a punch. This was how Lila understood her father, in measurements of time before violence, in patterns of escalation, in the mathematics of surviving a man who'd never learned control. "He was on a horse in my yard," Caleb said gently. "He knew if he got too angry, I'd shoot him. That's different than him having power over you and your mama." "So being scared of getting shot makes people nicer?" "Sometimes. Fear's a useful teacher when nothing else works." "Then Papa should be scared more often." The simple logic was irrefutable. Mara pulled her daughter close, and they sat together as the night slowly bled toward dawn and the barn finally collapsed into a smoldering foundation of ash and memory. Morrison arrived with the sunrise, bringing 3 deputies and a grim expression that suggested he'd expected something like this. He examined the burn site, documented the multiple points of ignition, studied the hoofprints, and held Evan's button up to the light like it might reveal secrets beyond its obvious significance. "This is enough for a warrant," he said finally. "Arson, terroristic threatening, attempted murder. Evan Rowan's going to jail." "Will he stay there?" Mara asked. "Until trial, yes. After that depends on the judge, the jury, and how good his lawyers are." Morrison's face showed the weariness of a man who'd seen justice delayed too many times. "But at least while he's locked up, he can't burn any more barns or threaten any more families." They rode to town in force, Morrison and his 3 deputies, Caleb with his rifle, Mara and Lila in the wagon. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of day that promised winter was coming whether anyone was ready or not. Cedar Ridge woke slowly around them as they rode down the main street toward Evan's house. People emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the unusual sight of the sheriff and his full complement of deputies moving with purpose. Whispers followed them like smoke. Evan's house, the white-painted home with green shutters that Caleb had carried Mara from weeks ago, sat quiet in the morning light. Too quiet. Morrison dismounted and approached the front door with his hand on his pistol, Caleb covering from the side while the deputies positioned themselves around the house. Morrison knocked. No answer. Knocked again, louder. Still nothing. "Evan Rowan, this is Sheriff Morrison. I have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door." Silence. Morrison tried the handle. The door swung open onto an empty hallway. They entered carefully, clearing rooms one by one, but it quickly became apparent that no one was home. More than that, the house had been emptied with deliberate haste. Drawers hung open, closets stood bare, personal effects had been stripped from walls and shelves. In the study, Morrison found a safe standing open and empty, its contents presumably converted to cash and carried away. On the desk, weighted down with a silver letter opener, lay a single sheet of paper covered in Evan's precise handwriting. Morrison read it aloud. "Sheriff Morrison, by the time you read this, I will be beyond your jurisdiction. I will not submit to false accusations levied by a hysterical woman and the man who's manipulated her for his own purposes. I am innocent of all charges, but I recognize that innocence means nothing against the tide of lies and conspiracy that has turned this town against me. Therefore, I am removing myself from these proceedings. Justice will ultimately prevail, but I will not allow myself to be railroaded by corrupt officials and vengeful liars. When this hysteria passes and truth emerges, I will return to reclaim what is rightfully mine. Until then, consider this my formal notice that I am no longer subject to the farce you call justice. Evan Rowan." The silence that followed felt heavy as stones. Mara's face had gone white, her breathing shallow. "He ran," she said. "He actually ran." "Looks like it." Morrison folded the letter carefully. "Probably left right after burning your barn. Figured we'd come for him come morning. Man like Evan, he's got resources. Money hidden, contacts in other territories, places he can disappear until he thinks it's safe to come back. Or until he decides to come back and finish what he started," Caleb said. Morrison nodded slowly. "That too. Running doesn't mean surrendering, just means regrouping." They searched the house thoroughly, but found nothing beyond evidence of hasty departure. Clothes left in drawers, food abandoned in the pantry, a life interrupted mid-sentence. In the bedroom Mara had shared with Evan, Caleb found her things still present. Dresses in the wardrobe, hairbrush on the vanity, small personal items that spoke of a woman who'd lived here in fear and fled with nothing. "You want any of this?" he asked. Mara looked at the room like it was a cage she'd escaped. "Burn it, burn all of it. I don't want anything that carries his memory." But Lila moved past them both to the vanity and picked up a small china doll sitting on the shelf. "Grandmama gave me this before she died. It's mine, not Papa's." "Then take it, sweetheart. Anything that's yours, you keep." They left with one china doll and nothing else. Behind them, Evan's house stood empty like a monument to lies finally exposed but not yet punished. Word of Evan's flight spread through Cedar Ridge faster than the barn fire had burned. By noon, the town had split into factions that argued in the street, in shops, in homes where neighbors who'd lived peacefully for years suddenly discovered they disagreed on fundamental questions of truth and justice. Some believed Evan was innocent, driven away by false accusations and mob mentality. Others saw his flight as admission of guilt. Innocent men didn't run from justice. Still others didn't care about guilt or innocence, only about the disruption to their comfortable illusions about the man who'd owned half their debts and all their secrets. Pastor Wells preached an emergency sermon about the persecution of righteous men, about wives who failed to submit, about outside agitators destroying families and communities. His congregation split down the middle, half nodding agreement, half walking out in disgust. Morrison faced calls for his resignation from the town council, who seemed to think enforcing the law against powerful men was somehow a betrayal of civic duty. He ignored them and kept working, sending telegraphs to sheriffs in neighboring territories, posting wanted notices, building the case for when Evan was eventually caught. Through it all, Caleb rebuilt. The barn was gone, but the land remained. The tools were lost, but he had hands and knowledge. Winter was coming, but they'd survived worse. Mara helped where she could. Her ribs finally healed enough for light work. Together they cleared the burned foundation, salvaged what little could be salvaged, and began planning reconstruction. It was slow work, made slower by the fact that most of Cedar Ridge's businesses refused to sell materials to Caleb on credit. The only exception was Mrs. Henderson at the general store, who extended them credit without being asked and refused to explain why. Beyond, some things are more important than money. Lila counted everything: boards, nails, steps from the house to the foundation, days since the fire. Her numbers had shifted from measuring danger to measuring progress, from survival to rebuilding. It was a small change, but Caleb noticed. Mara noticed too, and sometimes late at night when the child was sleeping, they'd talk about it. "She's healing," Mara said one evening while they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Slowly, but healing." "So are you." "Am I?" "Because some days I still wake up expecting Evan to be standing over me. I still count the hours between waking and sleeping, still measure my own breathing to make sure it's even. 3 years of survival don't disappear in a few weeks." "No, but they change shape from survival to recovery, from counting breaths to counting days." Mara's hand found his in the darkness. "What are we, Caleb? You and me. This thing we're building between rebuilding a barn and waiting for Evan to come back." The question hung in the cold air. Caleb thought about Rachel, about the love he'd buried on the hill behind the house, about how he'd thought his heart had died with her, had spent 5 years living like a man whose future was nothing but repetition of an empty present. Then Lila had run 3 miles on bleeding feet, and Mara had trusted him with her journal, and suddenly the future held possibility again. "I don't know what we are," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to go back to being alone. I know I wake up thinking about you and Lila, go to sleep making sure you're safe, spend every hour in between trying to build something that feels like home instead of just a place to wait." "Is that enough?" "After Rachel. Rachel was my wife. I loved her completely, and losing her nearly destroyed me. But she's gone, and I'm still here, still breathing, still capable of caring about people who need me." Caleb squeezed Mara's hand gently. "I don't know if what I feel for you is love or gratitude, or just 2 broken people holding each other upright, but I know it matters. And maybe that's enough for now." "For now?" Mara echoed. "Until Evan comes back." "If he comes back." "When?" Men like Evan don't surrender. They retreat, they plan, they wait for the moment when you've relaxed your guard. Then they strike. She was right, and Caleb knew it. Evan Rowan had spent 20 years building power, had killed at least one woman and nearly killed another. Men like that didn't reform or forget. They nursed grievances until they became obsessions, and obsessions drove them to actions beyond reason. The appeal hearing happened without Evan present. Judge Thornton read the case files, examined both journals, heard testimony from Morrison and Dr. Fletcher and Margaret Carlyle, who traveled to the Capitol specifically to speak about her daughter's death. Coleman, Evan's lawyer, argued for dismissal based on his client's absence and inability to defend himself. Thornton listened to everything, then delivered his ruling with the cold precision of a man who'd seen through better lies than these. Mr. Rowan's flight from justice speaks louder than any testimony he might have given. An innocent man does not burn barns and flee his home in the night. This court finds that Judge Harrison's original ruling stands. Custody of Lila Rowan remains with her mother, Mara Rowan. Furthermore, based on evidence presented, including historical documentation of similar violence against Eleanor Carlyle, this court issues a permanent restraining order prohibiting Evan Rowan from any contact with Mara or Lila Rowan. Should he return to this territory, he will be arrested on sight for arson, terroristic threatening, and attempted murder. This court also recommends the territorial prosecutor investigate charges of manslaughter in the death of Eleanor Carlyle 20 years ago. Morrison brought the news personally, riding out to the ranch where Caleb and Mara were framing the new barn. They'd managed to get the basic structure up, posts and beams, though the roof and walls would have to wait for more materials. "You won," Morrison said without preamble. "Complete custody, permanent protection order, and Evans wanted for arrest if he ever shows his face again." Mara sat down hard on a pile of lumber, like her legs had stopped working. "We won." "You won, though I'd feel better if we actually had Evan in custody instead of just a warrant." Morrison's expression darkened. Man like him, with money and motivation, he could disappear for years, could also come back when we least expect it. "We'll be ready," Caleb said. "Will you? Because being ready means living every day like he might show up. Means sleeping with one eye open, checking shadows, never really relaxing. That's a hard way to live." "Harder than living with him? Harder than counting breaths between beatings?" Mara's voice carried steel. "I'll take vigilance over submission any day." Morrison tipped his hat. "Fair enough. Just wanted you to know what you're signing up for." He turned his horse toward town, then looked back. "Oh, and Mrs. Henderson asked me to tell you she's extending your credit another $100. Said something about investing in the future she wants to see." After Morrison left, Caleb and Mara stood in the skeleton of the new barn, sunlight streaming through gaps where walls would eventually be. Lila played nearby, arranging stones into patterns only she understood, counting them quietly. "We won," Mara said again, like testing the words for truth. "The first round. There'll be others." "I know. But for now, today, this moment, we won. Lila is legally mine. Evan can't touch us without being arrested, and we're building something new where he burned something old." She turned to face Caleb. "That's victory enough for today. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we keep building. We finish this barn. We plant winter wheat. We live our lives like free people instead of fugitives." Mara's smile carried something Caleb hadn't seen before. Not just hope, but certainty. "And if Evan comes back, we face him together, like we've faced everything else." Caleb pulled her close, careful of her still tender ribs, and they stood together in the half-built barn while Lila counted stones and the sun tracked across a sky that held no smoke, no threats, just the clean promise of afternoon fading toward evening. Weeks passed into months. The barn rose board by board, nail by nail, until it stood complete, smaller than before but solid, built from lumber that hadn't burned and labor that meant something beyond mere construction. Winter came early, bringing snow that buried the valley in white silence. Caleb taught Lila to read tracks in the snow, to identify animals by their prints, to understand the language the land spoke for those who learned to listen. Mara's bruises faded completely, leaving only memory in their wake. She grew stronger, her laughter coming easier, her movements losing that careful quality of someone always prepared to defend or flee. At night, she slept without counting, without the nightmares that had plagued her first weeks at the ranch. Christmas came quietly. They had little money for gifts, but Caleb carved Lila a wooden horse that looked almost exactly like Goliath, and Mara sewed him a shirt from fabric Mrs. Henderson had donated. Lila gave them both drawings she'd made, careful counted representations of their family, 3 figures standing together in front of a house and barn, smiling. "That's us," she explained. "I counted all our smiles yesterday. Mama smiled 17 times. Mr. Hart smiled 9 times. I smiled 23 times. So I drew us all smiling together." They hung the drawing in the kitchen where they could see it every day, a reminder that survival had transformed into something that looked almost like happiness. But Caleb never stopped watching the roads, never stopped checking the locks at night, never stopped keeping his rifle close and his instincts sharp. Because Mara was right. Men like Evan didn't surrender. They waited, and they planned, and eventually they came back. The question wasn't if, it was when, and what they'd do when that day arrived. January brought a cold snap that froze the creek solid and sent the cattle huddling against windbreaks for warmth. Caleb spent his days breaking ice, hauling feed, making sure the stock survived. Mara worked beside him when she could, and Lila helped in her own way, counting cattle to make sure none had wandered off, measuring feed to ensure fair distribution. They'd settled into rhythms that felt like family, breakfast together, work divided by capability rather than gender, evenings spent reading aloud or playing simple games Lila invented that always involved counting. Caleb found himself thinking less about Rachel and more about the present, about the life he was building with these 2 people who'd come to him broken and were slowly becoming whole. Then, on a night so cold the stars looked like ice chips scattered across black velvet, the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the door, deliberate and demanding. Caleb was on his feet with his rifle before the second knock finished, positioning himself between the door and where Mara and Lila sat at the kitchen table. Mara's hand went to the knife she'd started carrying, and Lila went absolutely still, her counting stopping mid-number. "Who's there?" Caleb called. "Sheriff Morrison. I got news you need to hear." Caleb recognized the voice, but caution had kept him alive through the war and through the months since the barn burned. He moved to the window and looked out. Morrison stood alone on the porch, his horse tied at the fence, his hands visible and empty of weapons. No sign of ambush or deception. Caleb opened the door. Morrison entered bringing cold air and an expression that aged him 10 years. "Evan's dead," the sheriff said without preamble. The words landed like physical blows. Mara stood so abruptly her chair fell backward. Lila's counting resumed, faster now, numbers tumbling over each other. "How?" Caleb demanded. "Found him in a boarding house in Santa Fe. He'd been using a false name, paying cash, keeping his head down. But he got into an argument with another resident 3 days ago over some perceived slight. The argument turned into a fight. Evan pulled a knife. The other man pulled a gun. Evan lost. Morrison pulled a document from his coat pocket. The territorial marshal in Santa Fe sent this telegram confirming identity and requesting disposition of the body. I told them to bury him there. Figured nobody here would want him brought back." Mara took the telegram with shaking hands, reading it twice as if the words might change between viewings. "He's really dead?" "He's really dead. Marshall says the boarding house keeper identified him positive, and they found documents in his room with his real name. It's him, Mrs. Rowan. He's gone." Lila's voice cut through the shock. "I counted 63 days since he burned the barn. 63 days of waiting for him to come back. Now he never will." The child's matter-of-fact delivery contrasted sharply with the enormity of what Morrison had announced. Evan Rowan, who'd dominated their lives through violence and fear, who'd forced them into hiding and vigilance, who'd seemed like an unstoppable force, dead over a boarding house argument hundreds of miles away. "What happens now?" Mara asked. "Nothing happens. Evan died intestate. No will, no clear heirs, since you're divorced and everything but final paperwork. His property, his businesses, they'll go to probate. Might take months to sort out, but you and Lila are free. No appeal to worry about, no threat hanging over you, no reason to keep looking over your shoulder." Morrison moved toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. Rowan, I'm sorry it took his death to give you peace. Would have been better if justice had worked the way it's supposed to. Trial, conviction, prison. But I'll take this outcome over him running free." After Morrison left, the three of them sat in the kitchen, not speaking, not moving, just processing the sudden absence of a threat that had defined their existence for so long. Finally, Mara stood and walked to the stove. She pulled out the cast iron pan and set it on the fire, then retrieved eggs and bacon from the cold box. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked. "Making breakfast for dinner." "Because we can. Because Evan's not here to criticize the meal or throw the pan or make me count minutes between cooking and serving." Her hands moved with deliberate care, cracking eggs, laying bacon in neat rows. "Because we survived, and he didn't, and that deserves commemorating." They ate breakfast at dinner time, the meal tasting like celebration and grief and relief all mixed together. Lila ate slowly, savoring each bite, counting chews in that way she had of measuring everything. "Mama," she said eventually, "can I stop counting now?" Mara set down her fork, her eyes filling with tears she didn't try to hide. "Sweetheart, you can do whatever feels right. If counting helps you feel safe, keep counting. If it doesn't help anymore, you can stop. There's no wrong answer." "But I've been counting since I was little, since before I can remember. I counted to know when to hide, when to run, when Mama was hurt too bad. What do I count now that there's nothing to be afraid of?" Caleb leaned forward, meeting the child's two old eyes. "Count whatever makes you happy instead of whatever keeps you safe. Count stars, count smiles, count days of peace instead of days of danger. Change what the numbers mean." Lila considered this seriously. "I could count how many times Mama laughs, or how many fence posts we fix together, or how many eggs the chickens lay." "Exactly. Those are better things to count than breaths and bruises. Much better." That night, Caleb stood on the porch watching the stars Lila would maybe count tomorrow, thinking about how death sometimes delivered justice when law couldn't. Evan Rowan was gone, erased from the world by the same kind of violence he'd dealt to others. There was symmetry in that, if not satisfaction. Mara joined him, wrapped in the quilt against the cold. "How do you feel?" she asked. "I don't know. Relieved, mostly. Maybe a little cheated that he got to die quick instead of facing trial for what he did." "I feel guilty," Mara admitted. "I should be dancing on his grave, celebrating his death. Instead, I just feel hollow, like I spent so much energy fearing him and fighting him that without that purpose, I don't know what to do with myself." "You live. You raise Lila. You build something that isn't defined by what you survived, but by what you choose." "Is that what you did? After Rachel?" Caleb thought about the 5 years between Rachel's death and Lila's arrival, the empty time he'd spent going through motions without purpose. "No, I just existed, went through the rhythms of staying alive without actually living. You're already doing better than I did. Because I have Lila. She's my reason to keep going, to be better, to build something worth having. And because you're stronger than I was. You fought when I would have quit." "Artemis." "Imam." Mara leaned against him, and they stood together in the cold, while inside, Lila slept peacefully for the first time in her short life without a father to fear. The next morning brought something unexpected: visitors. Not the threatening kind that had plagued them for months, but Margaret Carlyle in her elegant buggy, followed by Mrs. Henderson from the general store, and behind them, half a dozen other women from town that Caleb vaguely recognized from the courthouse hearing. They came bearing food, fabric, tools, and offers of help. Margaret spoke for them all, her voice carrying the authority of grief transformed into purpose. "Mrs. Rowan, we heard about Evan's death. We came to tell you that you're not alone. That what happened to Eleanor, what happened to you, it matters. And we're not going to let anyone forget that silence protects predators while truth protects the vulnerable." The women spent the day helping with chores, sharing stories, building connections that had been prevented by fear and social pressure. Caleb heard fragments of their conversations. Other women who'd suffered smaller violences, who'd been told to submit and endure, who'd watched Mara fight back and found courage in her example. By evening, the ranch felt different. Not just the work that had been completed, but the sense of community that had formed. These women had chosen sides when silence would have been easier, had offered support when isolation was expected. After they left, Mara stood in the kitchen surrounded by gifts and provisions, her face showing wonder. I thought the whole town hated us. Thought we were alone against everyone. We were alone against some people. Turns out others were just waiting for permission to help. Permission to care, permission to act, permission to believe that one woman telling truth mattered more than one powerful man telling lies. Mara touched the food covering every surface. This is what victory looks like, not courtroom rulings or death notices. This, people choosing courage over comfort. That night, they sat together planning the future. What crops to plant come spring, whether to expand the cattle herd, how to use Evan's property once probate settled. The conversation felt surreal, like discussing dreams instead of plans. But Caleb went along with it because hope was a muscle that needed exercising after long disuse. Lila fell asleep between them on the porch bench, warm despite the cold, secure in a way children should always be but rarely were. Caleb looked at her peaceful face and thought about all the numbers she wouldn't have to count anymore. We should get married, he said abruptly. Mara went very still. What? Not now, not tomorrow, but eventually. When you're ready, when it feels right instead of necessary. Caleb stumbled over the words, unpracticed in proposals. I'm not Rachel's replacement, and you're not just someone I'm helping. We've built something real here, something worth naming. Caleb Hart, are you proposing to me? Badly, apparently, but yes. Mara's laugh came soft and genuine. Then my answer is maybe. Ask me again in 6 months when I've had time to remember who I am without Evan defining me. When I know I'm choosing you because I want to, not because I need to. That's fair. But Caleb? Yes? Thank you for asking. Thank you for seeing me as someone worth choosing instead of someone worth saving. They sat in comfortable silence while the stars wheeled overhead and Lila dreamed whatever dreams came to children who'd stopped counting their mother's breaths. The future stretched uncertain but possible, carrying neither the weight of the past nor the fear of violence returning. Evan Rowan was dead. The threat had ended not with drama or confrontation, but with simple finality. And in the space his death created, 3 people who'd come together through trauma began transforming into family. Not because they had to, because they chose to. Spring arrived tentatively, like something that had forgotten its own purpose and needed reminding. Snow melted in uneven patches, revealing brown grass that would green given time and warmth. The creek thawed and ran high with runoff, its voice filling the valley with sound that spoke of renewal and continuation. Caleb stood at the fence line watching the water rush past, thinking about how 6 months could transform everything. The barn stood complete and sturdy, its wood still raw and new, but weathering gradually into something that belonged to the land. The cattle had survived winter fat enough to breed well come summer. The ranch had recovered from fire and threat, had absorbed damage and rebuilt stronger. But it was the people who'd changed most. Mara no longer moved through the world like someone expecting blows. Her shoulders had straightened, her laughter came without hesitation, and she'd taken to managing the ranch's finances with the same meticulous attention she'd once devoted to documenting injuries. The journals, both hers and Eleanor's, sat in a locked box under her bed, their purpose fulfilled but their existence still necessary as reminder and record. Lila had grown 2 inches and gained weight that softened the sharp angles of near starvation. She still counted things, but the counting had shifted from survival mechanism to simple preference. She counted eggs, fence posts, wildflowers, stars, quantifying the world not from fear, but from the pure mathematics of a mind that found comfort in numbers. Her nightmares had faded, replaced by dreams she reported each morning with serious enthusiasm. And Caleb himself had discovered that hearts broken by loss could still learn to hope again, that isolation chosen from grief could be replaced by connection, chosen from something that felt increasingly like love. The question he'd asked 6 months ago, whether Mara would marry him, hung unresolved between them, neither forgotten nor urgently pursued. They'd settled into a rhythm that felt like marriage already, shared labor, shared meals, shared responsibility for Lila, shared warmth on cold nights when comfort became something more but stopped short of commitment that required speaking aloud. Mara found him at the fence as the sun climbed toward noon, her arms full of the mail Morrison had brought from town. "There's a letter from the territorial probate court," she said, handing him an official-looking envelope. Caleb opened it and scanned the contents. Evan's estate has been settled. His properties and assets are being distributed per territorial law since he died without a will or recognized heirs. How much? The house in town goes to auction. His business interests are being sold to pay debts. But there's a settlement coming to you. Widow's portion, they're calling it, even though the divorce was never finalized. Looks like about $8,000 once everything sells. Mara sat down hard on a fence post, the number clearly overwhelming. $8,000. That's more money than I've seen in my entire life. It's yours. Compensation for what you endured, maybe, or just legal distribution of marital property. Either way, it's yours to do with as you want. What I want, Mara repeated slowly, testing the words like something foreign. I've spent so long being told what to want, how to want it, when wanting itself was permitted. I don't know how to just decide. Caleb sat beside her, their shoulders touching. Start small. What do you want for breakfast tomorrow? Pancakes, with real maple syrup, not the corn syrup Evan insisted on because it was cheaper. What do you want to plant in the garden? Flowers, not just vegetables for eating, but flowers for looking at. Roses, maybe. And those purple things. What are they called? Lavender. Lavender. I want lavender that smells good and serves no purpose except beauty. What do you want for Lila? Mara's eyes found her daughter across the yard, where the child was arranging stones into elaborate patterns. I want her to go to school, real school, not just me teaching her reading and numbers at the kitchen table. I want her to have friends, to learn things I can't teach her, to grow up knowing that intelligence and curiosity are gifts instead of dangers. Cedar Ridge has a school. The teacher's a widow named Catherine Morris. She's strict but fair, and she doesn't tolerate bullying. Will they accept Lila? After everything that happened with Evan, after the whole town took sides? The town's changing. Some people are leaving, the ones who tied their fortunes too closely to Evan's reputation. Others are staying and trying to do better. Mrs. Henderson's organizing the women into a society for supporting families in crisis. Margaret Carlisle donated money to build a shelter for women fleeing violence. Pastor Wells retired and a new minister came in who preaches about justice instead of submission. Mara listened with an expression that suggested she was hearing about a different town than the one she'd known. All because I fought back. All because you documented truth and refused to accept that power meant immunity. You changed things, Mara. Changed how people think about violence and silence and whose voice matters. I just wanted to survive. To get Lila somewhere safe. Sometimes survival is the most revolutionary act. Sometimes refusing to die quietly changes everything. They sat together watching the creek run high with spring melt, listening to Lila's voice drift across the yard as she counted stones in groups of 7, because 7 was her new favorite number. The moment felt suspended, like standing at a crossroads where every direction led somewhere different. Caleb, Mara said finally, ask me again. Ask you what? What you asked 6 months ago. Ask me again. Caleb turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. They were work-roughened now, calloused from labor and healing, strong in ways they hadn't been when she'd first arrived broken and terrified. Mara Rowan, will you marry me? Not because you need protection or I need purpose, but because we've built something worth naming. Because Lila deserves a family that chooses itself instead of one bound by law or necessity. Because I love you. The words came easier than he'd expected, probably because they'd been sitting in his chest for months waiting for permission to emerge. Mara's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, her grip on his hands tightening. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you, not to replace Rachel or escape Evan, but because you're the first person who saw me as someone worth believing instead of someone worth controlling. Because you taught Lila that counting could measure joy instead of pain. Because I love you too. They kissed then, gentle and careful, a promise more than passion. Across the yard, Lila looked up from her stones and smiled before returning to her counting, apparently unsurprised by this development. The wedding happened 6 weeks later in the new barn, because Mara refused to be married in Pastor Wells's church, and the barn felt like the right place for new beginnings built on old foundations. The new minister, a young man named Thomas Fletcher, nephew to the doctor, performed the ceremony before a gathering that included Morrison and his wife, Margaret Carlyle, Mrs. Henderson and half the women from her society, Deputy Webb looking uncomfortable in a suit, and a dozen others from town who'd chosen courage over comfort. Lila stood between them during the ceremony, her hand in Mara's and her other hand in Caleb's, making them 3 instead of 2. When the minister asked if anyone objected, the child spoke up clearly. "I counted everyone here. 23 people came to see Mama marry Mr. Hart. That's 23 people who chose love over fear. I think that's a good number." Laughter rippled through the gathering, warm and genuine. The minister smiled and continued with the vows, his voice carrying the weight of promises that mattered because they were chosen freely. "Do you, Caleb Hart, take Mara Rowan to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" "I do." "And do you, Mara Rowan, take Caleb Hart to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Mara's voice rang clear and strong. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory and in the sight of these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." They kissed to applause and tears, to Lila's delighted counting of how many seconds the kiss lasted, to the knowledge that this marriage was built on foundation strong enough to survive storms because it had already survived the worst storms could offer. The celebration afterward was simple. Food brought by guests, music played by Morrison on a fiddle Caleb hadn't known the sheriff owned, dancing in the barn that smelled of fresh wood and new hay. Lila danced with everyone who asked, her laughter filling spaces that had held only fear and silence months ago. As evening settled and guests began departing, Margaret Carlyle approached Caleb and Mara with an envelope in her hands. "This is for Lila," she said. "A trust fund to pay for her education. School now, university later if she wants it. Eleanor would have been 28 this year if Evan hadn't killed her. I like to think she'd want her death to mean something, to help another girl have the future she was denied." Mara accepted the envelope with shaking hands. "Mrs. Carlyle, this is too generous." "It's not generous. It's necessary. Eleanor's story needed telling, and you told it. This is my thank you." Margaret touched Mara's face gently. "You survived what my daughter couldn't. You fought what I was too afraid to fight. You gave me permission to speak truth 20 years too late, but better late than never. So this isn't charity. It's investment in a future where girls like Eleanor and Lila don't have to count their mother's breaths to survive." After Margaret left, Caleb and Mara stood together in the barn's doorway, watching the last guests ride away into twilight. Lila had fallen asleep on a pile of hay inside, exhausted by excitement and dancing. "We did it," Mara said softly. "We actually did it. Survived Evan, won in court, built a life worth living. You did it. I just helped. No, we did it together. That's what made it possible, not being alone anymore, not having to carry everything by myself." Caleb gathered her close. This woman who'd documented her own destruction, hoping someone might believe her, who'd taught her daughter mathematics of survival, who'd transformed trauma into testimony and testimony into change. "What do you want to do with the settlement money, besides Lila's education?" "I want to buy Evan's house." The answer surprised him. "Why? I thought you'd want to burn it like you burned your memories." "I did want that, but Margaret's right. Eleanor's death needed to mean something. So did my suffering. So did every woman's pain that was ignored or dismissed or explained away." Mara's voice strengthened with certainty. "I want to buy that house and turn it into what Margaret suggested, a shelter for women fleeing violence, a place where they can go to be safe, to heal, to plan their next steps. I want to take the place where Evan hurt me and transform it into a place where women find help." "That's a beautiful idea. It's a practical idea. because there are other women out there right now counting breaths, teaching their children when to run, documenting injuries in secret journals. And they need somewhere to go that isn't a stranger's ranch 3 miles from town. They need something permanent and purposeful. Then we'll do it. Buy the house, renovate it, create something that makes sure Evan's legacy is helping people instead of hurting them. They moved back inside where Lila slept peacefully. Her small face relaxed in a way that still seemed miraculous given where she'd started. Caleb touched her hair gently, and Mara leaned against him, the three of them forming a tableau of family chosen rather than inherited. The work of transforming Evan's house began in early summer. Mara organized it with the same methodical attention she'd once devoted to documenting violence. But now the list tracked progress instead of pain. Walls to knock down, rooms to renovate, supplies needed, volunteers recruited. Mrs. Henderson donated furniture. Margaret Carlyle paid for a full renovation of the kitchen and bathrooms. The Women's Society contributed labor, spending weekends stripping wallpaper that held too many memories and painting over darkness with light colors that promised new beginnings. Even Morrison helped, his carpentry skills turning small bedrooms into spaces that could house families temporarily. He worked alongside Caleb, the two men finding easy companionship in shared labor. "Never thought I'd see the day," Morrison said while framing a new wall. Evan Rowan's house of horrors becoming a shelter for the women he'd have victimized. Seems fitting. Turn his weapon into armor for someone else. Your wife's something special, you know that? Most people who survive what she survived, they just want to forget. Move on, pretend it never happened, but she's turning her survival into service. She's stronger than anyone gives her credit for, including herself sometimes. Morrison hammered a nail with more force than necessary. You're good for each other, her strength and your steadiness. Lila's lucky to have you both. The shelter opened in August with a small dedication ceremony. Mara stood on the porch of the house that had been her prison and spoke to the gathered crowd about transformation and hope, about how places could be redeemed just like people could, about the importance of converting private pain into public purpose. This house held secrets that protected one man's power at the cost of multiple women's safety, she said, her voice carrying to everyone assembled. Now it will hold women and children who need protection while they rebuild their lives. It will be a place where truth is believed, where violence is not excused, and where every person who enters is treated with dignity and respect. We're calling it Eleanor's House, in memory of Eleanor Carlyle, who deserved better than what she got, but whose story is helping others get what they deserve. Margaret Carlyle cut the ribbon, tears streaming down her face, and the shelter opened its doors. Within a week, 3 families had sought refuge there. A woman with 2 children fleeing a husband who'd broken her arm. A young girl escaping an arranged marriage to a man twice her age. A widow whose adult son had become violent and threatening. Mara ran Eleanor's house with quiet competence, hiring Catherine Morris from the school to help manage residents and coordinate resources. Together they created rules that balanced safety with dignity, structure with flexibility, accountability with compassion. Caleb watched his wife transform into someone he barely recognized from the broken woman who'd arrived at his ranch, confident, purposeful, steady in her conviction that survival obligated service. She divided her time between the shelter and the ranch, between helping others and building her own family, between remembering pain and creating joy. Lila started school that fall, her nervousness about meeting other children gradually giving way to cautious friendship. She came home each day full of stories about lessons and playground games, about the teacher who praised her mathematics skills, and the classmates who thought counting stones was strange but interesting. Tommy Henderson said, "I count too much," Lila reported one evening over dinner. He said normal people don't count everything. What did you say? Mar asked. I said counting helped me survive when things were bad, and now it helps me appreciate when things are good. I said everyone has their way of making sense of the world, and counting is mine. That's very wise. Miss Morris said so too. She said, mathematics is a language for understanding reality, and I'm fluent in a language most people only speak poorly. Lila paused. I like Miss Morris. She makes learning feel important instead of scary. At night, after Lila slept and the ranch settled into quiet darkness, Caleb and Mara would sit together on the porch they'd rebuilt after the fire. Sometimes they talked about the day's work, the shelter's needs, the ranch's progress. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that came from knowing each other well enough that words weren't always necessary. One night in late September, with autumn turning the cottonwoods gold and the first frost warning of winter ahead, Mara broke their comfortable silence with a question. "Do you think about her, Rachel?" The question didn't hurt the way it might have a year ago. Caleb considered it honestly. "Sometimes. Not as much as I used to. The grief doesn't go away, but it changes shape, becomes something I carry instead of something that carries me." "Do you feel guilty for loving me when you loved her?" "No. Rachel would have wanted me to be happy, would have been angry if I'd spent the rest of my life alone out of some misplaced loyalty to her memory." Caleb took Mara's hand. "Love isn't finite. Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for Rachel. It just means my heart was bigger than I thought. I worry sometimes that I'm using you, that I said yes to marriage because I needed safety, not because I genuinely loved you. And now? Now I know the difference. Between needing someone and loving them. Between gratitude and genuine affection." Mara's grip tightened. "I love you, Caleb Hart. Not because you saved me, though you did. Not because you gave us a home, though you did. But because you're kind and steady, and you taught my daughter that counting could measure joy instead of just pain. Because you see me as strong instead of broken. Because you make me want to be the person you seem to think I am. You're already that person. You always were. You just needed space to remember it." They kissed then, and the kiss deepened into something more, into the physical expression of promises made and kept, of trust earned and given freely. Later, lying together in the darkness of the room they'd shared for months, Mara spoke again. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like stars, bright, surprising, impossible to ignore. Caleb sat up, trying to see her face in the darkness. "Are you sure?" "Dr. Fletcher confirmed it yesterday. I'm about 8 weeks along, due in late April, early May." 1,000 emotions cascaded through Caleb simultaneously: joy, fear, wonder, grief for the child he'd lost with Rachel, hope for the child coming with Mara. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified, hopeful, grateful." Mara's hand found his in the darkness. "I never thought I'd want another child after Lila. Never thought I'd feel safe enough to bring new life into the world. But this baby was conceived in love instead of fear, will be born into a home instead of a prison. That feels like healing." "We're going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby," Mara confirmed, and her voice carried laughter and tears in equal measure. They told Lila the next morning over breakfast. The child processed the information with characteristic seriousness, counting on her fingers. "A baby will come in April or May. That's 7 or 8 months from now, approximately 210 to 240 days. She looked up from her counting. "Will the baby be a boy or a girl?" "We won't know until they're born," Mara said. "Can I teach them counting? I'm very good at it." "You can teach them whatever you want." "Good, because numbers are important. They help you understand the world." Lila returned to her breakfast, the news apparently integrated into her understanding of reality with minimal disruption. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall into winter. Mara's body changed, swelling with life that showed despite thick winter clothing. She continued managing Eleanor's house until December, when Dr. Fletcher insisted she rest more and work less. Catherine Morris took over day-to-day operations, visiting the ranch weekly to consult on decisions and update Mara on residents. Christmas that year felt abundant in ways that had nothing to do with gifts or decorations. They celebrated as a family, Caleb, Mara, and Lila, with Margaret Carlyle joining them for dinner, the older woman having no family of her own, but having adopted them as surrogate kin. Lila gave everyone drawings again, but this year they included a fourth figure, small and swaddled, representing the sibling she'd never met but already counted as part of their family. Margaret gave Lila books, beautiful volumes of poetry and natural history that the child devoured with the hunger of someone discovering that knowledge could be pursued for pleasure instead of survival. Caleb gave Mara a rocking chair he'd built through the fall, carving their initials and Lila's into the headrest, leaving space for the new baby's initials to be added after birth. Mara gave him a pocket watch with an inscription on the inside cover that read, "Time measured in love instead of loss." They spent the evening reading together, Lila curled against Mara's expanding belly, with her hand resting where she could feel the baby move, Margaret dozing in the chair by the fire, Caleb reading aloud from a book of frontier stories that made them all laugh. The winter passed slowly, but not unpleasantly. Caleb managed the ranch, Mara nested and planned and grew, Lila attended school and brought home stories and questions in equal abundance. The shelter continued operating, housing women and children fleeing situations that once would have had no escape. Each family that found safety there validated the choice to transform Evan's house from symbol of power into instrument of protection. Spring arrived with the usual tentative hope, and with it came Mara's labor. It started on an April morning when frost still painted the grass white and the sun hadn't yet burned through the chill. Mara woke Caleb with gentle pressure on his shoulder, her voice calm despite the pain he could see in her eyes. "It's time. The baby's coming." Caleb moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before, even though last time had ended in tragedy. He sent Lila to fetch Dr. Fletcher while he got Mara settled, built up the fire, boiled water, gathered clean linens. All the ordinary preparations for the extraordinary moment of birth. Dr. Fletcher arrived within the hour, his nephew Thomas Fletcher, the minister, riding with him because apparently medical skill ran in the family, and Thomas had trained as a midwife before taking up ministry. Between them, they brought competence and calm that eased Caleb's fear. "I've delivered 300 babies in 40 years, Dr. Fletcher said. Haven't lost a mother yet, and only lost 2 infants to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Mara's healthy, the baby's positioned right, and we've got time. This will be fine." The labor lasted through the morning into afternoon. Mara's pain managed with breathing and walking, and the laudanum Dr. Fletcher offered sparingly. Caleb stayed beside her when she wanted company, stepped away when she needed space, held her hand when contractions hit hard enough to make her gasp. Lila waited outside with Margaret Carlyle, counting birds that landed on the fence posts, apparently convinced that if she counted enough birds, the baby would arrive safely. It was magical thinking of the kind children embraced, and no one had the heart to discourage it. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Mara's labor intensified. Dr. Fletcher checked her progress and nodded with satisfaction. "It's time to push, Mrs. Hart. On the next contraction, you push with everything you have." What followed was raw and primal and beautiful in ways Caleb hadn't expected. Mara pushed with strength he'd witnessed before, but never in this context, her body doing work that required every ounce of power she'd accumulated through survival and healing. Between contractions she rested, gathering energy for the next wave, her face showing determination that had brought her through 3 years of violence into this moment of creation. "I can see the head," Thomas Fletcher called from his position, assisting his uncle. "One more push, maybe 2. You're almost there, Mrs. Hart." Mara pushed again, her cry of effort filling the room, and then suddenly there was another sound, a baby's first breath, first cry, first announcement that they'd arrived and demanded recognition. "It's a boy," Dr. Fletcher announced, lifting the infant and placing him on Mara's chest. "Healthy lungs, all his fingers and toes, good color, perfect." The baby, their son, lay on Mara's chest, wailing his displeasure at the cold world after months of warm darkness. Mara touched his face with wonder, her tears falling onto his dark hair, and Caleb found himself crying too, overcome by emotions he couldn't name. "Hello, little one," Mara whispered. "Welcome to the world. You're safe here. You're loved here. You'll never have to count anything but stars and flowers and days of peace." Lila burst into the room despite instructions to wait, Margaret following more sedately. The child approached the bed cautiously, her eyes wide with wonder. The baby came. "I counted 97 birds, and then the baby came. Is that a good number?" "That's a perfect number," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "Can I hold him?" Mara shifted carefully, making space for Lila to sit beside her. They positioned the baby in Lila's arms with proper support, and the child studied her new brother with serious attention. "He's very small. How much does he weigh?" Dr. Fletcher laughed. Haven't weighed him yet, but I'd guess 7.5 pounds, maybe 8. That's a good weight for a baby. Miss Morris taught us about averages. He's right in the average range. Lila touched the baby's hand, and his tiny fingers wrapped around her finger reflexively. He's strong. I think he's going to be good at counting, too. They named him Samuel James Hart. Samuel for Caleb's father, who died when Caleb was young. James for the best friend Caleb had lost at Missionary Ridge. The names carried weight and memory, connected the baby to history while giving him his own identity. Over the next weeks, they settled into the rhythm of new parenthood, sleepless nights and endless diapers, nursing and rocking, and the exhausting wonder of caring for something so small and helpless. Lila helped where she could, counting Samuel's breaths when he slept to make sure he was still breathing, measuring his growth in increments that satisfied her need for quantification. Mara healed well from the birth, her body recovering faster than it had after Lila because this time there was no violence to heal from, only the natural trauma of childbirth. She nursed Samuel with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd nearly lost everything and refused to take any blessing for granted. Caleb watched his family with something approaching awe. A year ago he'd been alone, convinced his life would be nothing but repetition of empty days until death released him. Now his house overflowed with noise and life and purpose. A wife who challenged him to be better. A daughter who taught him that numbers could measure hope. A son who represented future instead of loss. On a warm evening in late May, with Samuel 6 weeks old and the world green with late spring growth, they gathered on the porch, all 4 of them plus Margaret Carlyle, who'd become family despite lacking blood connection. Morrison and his wife stopped by with a gift for Samuel, a hand-carved cradle the sheriff had made himself. Figured the boy needed somewhere proper to sleep, Morrison said gruffly, embarrassed by his own generosity. They sat together as evening settled, adults talking quietly while Lila counted fireflies emerging in the gathering darkness, and Samuel slept in his new cradle. The conversation drifted across various topics: the shelter's success, the ranch's prospects, plans for expanding the cattle herd, whether Lila would continue enjoying school come fall. Eventually, Margaret spoke into a comfortable silence. Eleanor would have loved this. Seeing her tragedy transformed into something that saves others, knowing that the house where she died became a place where women find life. She made it possible, Mara said. Her diary gave me courage to use my own. Her death gave me determination to survive. Everything good that came from my testimony exists because she documented her truth 20 years ago. Then let's toast to Eleanor, Morrison said, raising his coffee cup since alcohol wasn't served in this household. To the woman whose silence was broken too late, but whose voice echoes in everyone you've helped since. They toasted, and the moment felt holy in a way that had nothing to do with churches or scripture and everything to do with human connection forged through shared pain and mutual support. After the guests left, Caleb and Mara put the children to bed. Lila in her room with her collections of stones and drawings, Samuel in his new cradle beside their bed. Then they returned to the porch and sat together watching stars emerge over the mountains. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Mara asked. "That you'd met me before Evan, before all the violence and fear? That we could have fallen in love like normal people instead of being thrown together by trauma?" Caleb considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. But then I think about how suffering shaped us into people capable of appreciating what we have. You learned strength I might never have valued otherwise. I learned that opening yourself to pain is the only way to open yourself to joy. We both learned that survival requires community, that isolation is a prison even when it's chosen." "So you're saying trauma made us better?" "No. I'm saying we made ourselves better despite trauma. There's a difference. The violence didn't improve us. Our response to it did." Mara leaned against him, fitting perfectly against his side the way she had since the first time they'd sat together like this. "I love you, Caleb Hart. Not because you saved me, though you did. Not because you gave me a home, though you did. But because you taught me that surviving wasn't enough, that we could thrive instead of just endure. I love you too, you and Lila and Samuel. You're my family, chosen and built, and worth every hardship that brought us together." They sat in silence after that, content to simply exist together in the peace they'd fought so hard to achieve. Inside, Samuel stirred and made soft sleeping sounds. Lila's window glowed with lamplight as she read before sleep. The ranch settled into darkness around them, secure and solid and theirs. The journals still existed, locked away but not forgotten. They'd become part of the historical record when Mara donated copies to the territorial archives, ensuring that Eleanor's story and her own would be preserved as testimony for future generations. Women decades from now could read those entries and know they weren't alone, that others had survived similar horrors and found ways to fight back. But the journals no longer defined Mara's present. They were evidence of where she'd been, not determinants of where she was going. She'd transformed from victim to survivor to advocate, had taken her pain and converted it into purpose that helped others escape what she'd endured. The shelter housed its 20th family that summer, a mother with 4 children fleeing a husband who'd escalated from verbal abuse to physical violence. Catherine Morris managed their intake while Mara consulted from the ranch, and together they created a safety plan that got the woman and her children to relatives in another territory where the husband couldn't find them. Each family that found refuge represented victory over the silence that had once protected predators like Evan. Each woman who documented her abuse and sought help proved that the culture was changing, that speaking truth was becoming safer even if it wasn't yet safe. Caleb continued ranching, but now he hired workers from town, men who'd lost employment when Evan's businesses collapsed and needed honest work. Together they expanded the herd, improved the grazing land, built infrastructure that would support the ranch for generations. The work was hard but satisfying, the kind of labor that produced tangible results and contributed to something larger than himself. Lila thrived in school, her mathematical gifts recognized and encouraged by Miss Morris. She made friends cautiously, still wary of trusting too freely, but gradually opening herself to connection. She brought classmates home occasionally, and Mara would find them in Lila's room counting stones or arranging flowers in numerical patterns, Lila teaching others the language of mathematics that had saved her. Samuel grew with the alarming speed of infants, transforming from tiny newborn to sturdy baby almost overnight. He smiled early, laughed often, and showed none of the fear that had marked Lila's early years. He'd been born into safety and love, had never known anything but gentle hands and soft voices, and it showed in his easy temperament and ready trust. On an evening in late August, almost exactly a year after Eleanor's house had opened, Mara stood in the barn, their barn, rebuilt from ashes, and surveyed the space where they'd been married. Caleb found her there, Samuel sleeping against her shoulder, her expression contemplative. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm counting," she said with a small smile. "Not the way Lila counts, measuring everything in numbers, but counting blessings, maybe. Counting the distance between where I was and where I am. That's a good kind of counting. A year ago I was terrified that Evan would come back, that the judge's ruling wouldn't hold, that somehow, despite everything, I'd end up back in that house being hurt while everyone looked away." She shifted Samuel slightly, his weight comfortable against her. "Now I'm here, safe, married to a good man, raising 2 children in a home built on honesty instead of fear. It feels miraculous." Not miraculous. Earned. You fought for this, documented your way out of violence, spoke truth even when silence would have been easier. "We fought for this," Mara corrected. "I couldn't have done it alone. You gave me space to be strong, believed me when belief mattered most, stood beside me instead of trying to save me." Caleb pulled her close, careful not to wake Samuel. "We're a good team. The best team." They stood together in the barn that had witnessed their marriage, their triumph over trauma, their choice to build future on the rubble of past. Outside, Lila's voice drifted through the evening air as she counted stars emerging in the darkening sky, her numbers a meditation instead of a measurement of fear. The world continued turning, seasons cycling from summer to fall to winter to spring in endless repetition. But for the people gathered in this ranch house at the edge of Cedar Ridge, time measured something different now. Not survival, but growth. Not endurance, but joy. Not counting breaths between violence, but counting stars in peaceful darkness. Evan Rowan was gone, his power dissolved, his legacy transformed from oppression into liberation. Eleanor Carlisle's death had been redeemed by the women her story saved. Mara's suffering had been converted into service that protected others from similar fates. And Lila, beautiful, brilliant Lila, who'd run 3 miles on bleeding feet counting to 500, no longer counted to survive. She counted because numbers were beautiful, because mathematics was poetry, because quantifying the world was her way of loving it. The journals sat in their locked box, preserved but no longer consulted daily. The scars, physical and emotional, remained but faded into evidence of survival rather than constant reminder of pain. The fear that had defined years of life gradually loosened its grip, replaced by trust earned through consistency and safety, built through community. On a crisp October morning, Caleb stood on the porch watching Lila walk to school, her lunch pail swinging at her side, her step confident. Mara emerged with Samuel on her hip, the baby babbling nonsense that would eventually become words. "She's happy," Mara observed, watching her daughter disappear around the bend in the road. "She is. You both are. So are you, I think. Despite everything, Rachel's death, 5 years alone, the violence that came when we arrived, you found your way back to happiness." Caleb thought about the man he'd been before Lila's arrival, isolated, grieving, convinced his life held nothing but empty repetition. That man felt like a stranger now, someone he'd been but no longer was. "Happiness isn't about forgetting pain," he said slowly. "It's about building something beautiful despite pain, about choosing connection even when isolation feels safer, about loving again even after loss." "Is that what we did? Built something beautiful?" He looked at her. This woman who'd survived what should have destroyed her, who transformed trauma into testimony and testimony into change. He looked at Samuel, innocent and trusting in ways Lila had never been allowed to be. He thought about Lila counting stars instead of breaths, measuring joy instead of pain. "Yes," he said with absolute certainty. "That's exactly what we did." Inside the house, the journals remained locked away, their purpose fulfilled but their importance undiminished. They existed as evidence that speaking truth mattered, that documentation could become weapon against power, that one woman's courage could ripple outward to protect hundreds of others. But they were no longer the defining feature of anyone's life. They were history, important, preserved, honored, but not determinative of future. The people who'd created those journals had moved beyond them, had built lives defined by choice rather than survival, by love rather than fear, by hope rather than despair. The ranch stretched green and productive around them, rebuilt from ashes into something stronger than before. The shelter operated in town, transforming Evan's house of horrors into sanctuary for the vulnerable. The community had changed, had learned that silence protected predators while truth protected victims, had chosen courage over comfort when it mattered most. And at the center of it all, a family that had chosen itself. Caleb, Mara, Lila, and Samuel, counting blessings instead of breaths, measuring love instead of loss, building future one peaceful day at a time. The counting had stopped being about survival and become about appreciation. The numbers that once measured danger now measured growth. The mathematics that once tracked violence now celebrated peace. Lila would grow up strong and whole, her intelligence celebrated instead of feared, her counting recognized as gift instead of coping mechanism. Samuel would know only love and safety, would never learn to measure his mother's pain because there would be no pain to measure. Mara would continue helping others escape what she'd survived, would spend her life ensuring that Evan's legacy was liberation instead of oppression. And Caleb would wake each morning grateful for the family that trauma had brought him, for the second chance at love he'd never expected, for the proof that broken hearts could heal if given time and care and community. The story that began with a child running through dust on bleeding feet had transformed into something hopeful and redemptive, not because trauma was noble or suffering was valuable, but because the people who endured that trauma had refused to let it define them. They'd taken their pain and built something beautiful with it. They'd survived, and then they'd thrived. On the hillside behind the house, 2 graves sat beneath the cottonwood tree. Rachel and the son Caleb had lost, their names carved into simple wooden markers that weathered gradually into the landscape. Caleb still visited them sometimes, still spoke to Rachel about the life he'd built after her death. still honored the love they'd shared. But now, when he visited those graves, he brought Samuel. He told Rachel about her successor, about the woman who'd taught him that loving again wasn't betrayal but affirmation of life's continuation. He imagined Rachel approving, imagined her glad that he'd found happiness instead of spending decades mourning what couldn't be recovered. The past existed, honored and remembered, but not controlling. The future stretched uncertain, but promising. And the present? This moment, this family, this peace earned through courage and maintained through vigilance, this was enough, more than enough. This was everything.